Hi everyone, this is Arcadius and welcome back to Naval Creed. So some of you may have already seen my video that I did a few weeks ago on my predictions for Naval Creed new tech trees. I went through some ships that could be added to the game for tech trees that already exist. I added some more tech trees for countries that already exist, and I even added tech trees for countries that don't exist in the game at this time. All with limiting variables of accuracy, obviously. It's always up to the game designers on what they want to do. I'm just explaining what I could theoretically see in the near future that would work and wouldn't break the game. Now, as far as the tech tree ships go, I think those are pretty good. Um, Honestly, that is the hardest thing to do, is to make a tech tree that actually works for the country itself, so weakest to strongest as you go through the tiers, and is balanced amongst all the other ships that are already in the game as well. However, there are other ships we can add. And those are the extraneous ships, if you may, like the Prism ships, Diamond ships, Free XP ships, Event ships, Rank Point ships. There's so many different ways you can purchase ships now that are not just in the tech tree. Um, so we have some options for all of those countries today. And we're going to start with Japan. So Japan actually doesn't have that many more ships I think we should see. We already do have quite a few special ships. That's how I'm going to address them from now on, is special ships. So we already have quite a few special ships already in the game. Cruisers, destroyers, battleships, everything you can think of. But there are a few more that I think we could use. And we'll go through all of these with pictures as well. And I'll explain all their stats and what consumables I think these ships could have, because the consumables is what's going to really make these ships shine. Sometimes it's just the history of the ship, or it's the uniqueness of the ship. There's something special about these ships that I think would bring something new to the table for these countries that's not already there with existing ships in the game. So first, we have 3 destroyers, Ninohi, Asagio, and Yugomo. We have 3 cruisers, Nishin, Hagiro, and Mogami CV conversion. 2 battleships, Issei, the battleship carrier conversion, Musashi 1942, and 2 carriers, Junyo and Unrio. Alright, so let's start with the destroyers. First one up is Ninohi. So this is actually a Hatsuharu class destroyer. I would have her at tier 7. This is the 1933 version of the Hatsuharu destroyer. So this is actually how that ship originally looked. It was supposed to be a less displacement or less heavy version of Fubuki, so an upgraded version, but with all the armament that Fubuki had. So as you can see here, that has 3 triple torpedo tubes of 610 millimeter or 24-inch caliber, and it only lost 1 gun compared to Fubuki, so it had 2 twin and 1 single 127 millimeter gun. This would be a pretty formidable opponent, honestly, and that's why I have her at tier 7 and not at tier 6, because tier 7 is where you have Akatsuki and you have Fubuki. So you already have ships that have this kind of armament, you just are dropping down 1 gun. Now, all of these ships that I'm going to go over already have the repair consumable. I only focused on the 2nd and 3rd consumable slots. So for this one, the 2nd consumable would either be smoke screen or torpedo reload booster, because that is something that we see already in game. For this 3rd consumable slot, we could either have speed boost or a hydroacoustic search. There's only 1 destroyer in the game right now currently that has hydroacoustic search, and that is the German Z1. I would like to see more of that, and giving a couple destroyers, or at least 1 destroyer, to each country that has the ability to have special consumables that they don't normally have, such as with Japan and Hydro. That would make the ship very, very unique. It would also make, so you're like trading 1 gun for another consumable. Overall, it's not terrible though. The ship is 36.5 knots in speed, has good gun power, pretty good torpedo power, and if you have those consumables, she'd be a pretty formidable opponent as well. And this is just a picture of how she actually was. If you'd like to know why the ships don't look nearly as they do in the game for the Hatsuharu class, it's because this layout was extremely top heavy, and on more than one occasion these ships almost or did just completely roll over and sink. So they were heavily reconstructed, and that's why we have the version we have in the game today. Moving on, the next one is Asagio. Now, Asagio is pretty similar to Hagiro. There's minimal improvements, honestly, but that's just in the ship itself. But you can also make differences in the armaments and consumables that would separate the ship from Hagiro in the game. So just a basic rundown on Asagio: 35 knot speed, tier 8, 3 twin 127mm guns, so the same as original Hagiro before you get the upgraded hull, and the same as Yukokaze, even though Yukokaze is at tier 9. We have 2 quadruple 610mm torpedo tubes. These are the 2 quad 24-inch that we also get on Hagiro. However, the torpedoes themselves would be different because I would like to give this ship deep water torpedoes. So you may, if you know the World of Warships game, you understand that Asagio in that game has deep water torpedoes as well, where you'd only be able to hit ships such as cruisers or battleships or carriers, or you can even make that even harder and just make it battleships and carriers. Regardless, with whatever they do, if you make the torpedoes only hit certain targets, but also add increased damage to those targets that they can hit, that would make her somewhat special as well. And I could see that being very useful in ranked or arena games, where you're not really a gunboat destroyer, even though you can hold your own with your gunfire or gun power. But your main focus is stealthily launching deep water torpedoes and doing massive amounts of damage to heavy and capital ships. For consumables, you would have your repair. Second consumable would just be smokescreen, and third consumable would be either speed boost, torpedo reload booster, or gun reload booster. So yes, you may not be able to hit destroyers with your torpedoes, but you would have a limited gun reload booster that would be able to help you in destroyer gunfights if you had to. Now, again, the gun reload booster consumable does need work. It needs a time duration where it's active throughout, not just a click and okay, your reload is slower now. Or basically what I'm trying to say is you need a consumable that lasts for like 30 seconds or however long they decide, that your reload during this time frame is shortened. Not just click it once, it shortens your reload once, and then that's all you get. Because that may work on battleships, but that's not going to work on anything that's not a battleship. And if they want to ever add a gun reload booster to a ship that's not a battleship, they need to add some work to it. Or at least make an entirely different new one. But at that point, you might as well just fix it. So this would be a pretty spicy little ship at tier 8. You already have more gunfire than the normal Hagiro because you get the third turret, the X turret. Hagiro with her C hull, I'm pretty sure, loses that third turret, but you can always drop it down to the Alpha or Bravo hull and still get it. You just lose anti-aircraft guns. The only reason why I don't use it is because the sister ship uses the C hull. It does not give you the option to use any other hull, so that's kind of unfortunate. But you'd have good gun power, you'd have the gun reload booster if you so wanted it, and you have deep water torpedoes that would be able to nail capital ships and heavy units pretty easily. But it'd be a very well balanced ship, I feel. Nothing too outlandish. And show you a picture of her. There we go. All right, next up is Yugomo, and this would be an 8.9 matchmaking destroyer, so a tier 9. So she would be up there with Yukokaze and Akazuki. So already some pretty heavy competition. Akazuki has rapid fire 4-inch guns that are pretty weak, but pretty fast. It has really good anti-aircraft defense for a Japanese destroyer. It's pretty much the only one that has anti-aircraft defense for a destroyer, a Japanese destroyer. Torpedoes hit hard and go far, but you only have one quad launcher. And then the ship itself is pretty slow. If you look at Yukukaze, you're pretty much a Hagiro with a heel at tier 9. That itself is pretty impressive as well. Yukukaze is not terrible, but the competition you go up against means you have to have a pretty decent level of skill with Japanese destroyers in order to make her shine. Something that sometimes I struggle with. But Yugomo would kind of be a mix of both of those, I feel. So the ship would go 35 knots. She has 3 twin 127mm guns, so the 3 twin guns, the same that we've normally seen, 1 in the front, 2 in the back, and the 2 quad 24-inch torpedo tubes amidships. So pretty much the same as Asagio, Hagiro, you name it. It's a generic Japanese destroyer layout. However, that is where the similarity ends. You see, for this ship, I would have her have sap shells or semi-armor piercing shells. And I don't know if I would give her armor piercing as well, or maybe just have her just have sap shells for the heck of it. Well, you could add armor piercing on there just for laughs and giggles, I guess. But sap shells would mean your chance to actually start fires would be really, really low. We see that on Mikhail Kutuzov, which already has sap shells in the game. However, your chance of actually penning armor and not just shattering with high explosive is a lot better. So not only could you take on destroyers with your guns pretty easily, but you could even take on cruisers pretty well, especially light cruisers. Destroyers, obviously, heavy cruisers potentially, and then you could mincemeat battleships with either sap if they're angled or armor piercing if they're broadside. And then carriers, you could use either one as well. So it would make the Japanese destroyers more of a better gunboat than anything. But you also have those strong torpedoes to back up on. But these would just be normal torpedoes. No deep water torpedoes, no nothing, just normal torpedoes there. For consumables, first one repair, second consumable either smokescreen or torpedo reload booster, depending on what you want to go for. And then third consumable is slightly different as well. We have a speed boost we could use, or defensive AA. Now, there used to be a defensive AA in the Japanese destroyer tech tree line on Akazuki. And I remember back in the day, I had her as a full anti-aircraft build, and she would shred planes like no one's business. And honestly, it was a lot of fun. You could get past her weak shells and her slow speed, because whenever a carrier would fly over you or attack you, you would just sit in your smoke screen, press defensive AA, and they would all fall down, and it was a lot of fun. If you know me, you know how much I love shooting down planes. However, they did take it away for some reason, I'm not quite sure. And they never really gave her anything in return. So you're just left with a slow ship that had limited number of torpedoes. It's a pretty large target, and its guns fired fast and had fast shell velocity, but it takes a while to actually sink anything and or just tickle it to death. So therefore Akazuki was not really any fun anymore. However, you could kind of get a little bit back of some of that fun back with Yugomo by giving her the speed boost or defensive AA. Obviously, it's not a lot of anti-aircraft defense. It would pretty much just be there to scatter the squadrons when they were attacking you. You might get 1 or 2, but hey, every little bit counts when you're in a Japanese destroyer. With that, those would be the 3 special destroyers that I would like to see in the game, especially Nanohi, the Hatsuharu one. That seems like a really fun and interesting ship. Alright, next we would have the cruisers, starting with Nish. Well, there's a picture of Yugomo here real quick. You can see the generic layout there. Okay, Nishin. Now, Nishin is actually a seaplane tender, but I have her listed as a cruiser for more than one option, because we already have examples of this in the game. We have Oyodo, primarily, So Yodo is the light cruiser with the two triple 155s in the front, and you have the ability to launch a bunch of fighters or a torpedo bomber squadron from the rear. You also have ships like Chikuma, which has the heavy cruiser armament in the front and seaplane dive bombers in the back. Same thing with the Gano, you can equip dive bombers. There's more than a few ships in the game that can equip more than just fighters that are not carriers. And I would want this to be one of them. This would pretty much be like a souped up Akitsushima or a Nagano or a Yodo. So the ship, I would have her at tier 5. She does go 28 knots, which is pretty fast for a tier 5 cruiser. However, you can tell just by this picture that she would be a very large cruiser, so very easy to hit. And as a seaplane tender, she actually doesn't have a lot of armor either. So you're a large target and you can't really handle damage that well. So your main way of attack is to stay behind, kind of like a Yodo, and just use your aircraft offensively. However, she does have a little bit of armament. She has 3 twin 140mm guns on the bow, as you can see there. So again, similar to Oyodo, you could bow into a target and use your gunfire. You're still going to take lots of damage, especially high explosive would just tear you apart, but you still do have offensive capability. And I'd say 3 twin 140s would be a little bit, or just about enough to take on a destroyer. So you could be offensive with the ship if you wanted to. But besides that, limited firepower. But the real place where she shines is the stern, where she would have the ability to carry 20 aircraft. You could make them dive bombers, you can make them torpedo bombers, you can make them fighters, who knows. At tier 5, there really isn't any other ship that can carry non-fighters. You don't get a Gano until 6.5, so pretty much a tier 6 or a tier 7 game. I guess it doesn't really matter which aircraft type you go with. You could just torpedo bombers, dive bombers, both are really good. I prefer torpedo bombers, but also dive bombers have a better chance at hitting and actually setting fires or whatever. So honestly, I don't really have a preference on which one I think this ship should have. But she would have 20 aircraft, potentially squadrons of 4, I would say. So you would have a pretty large amount of aircraft to go through. For consumables, you would have a repair. Second consumable, you would have a heal, just a normal heal. And then for your third consumable, you could either have the seaplane servicing consumable, which would drop the reload time of your squadrons down by a certain amount. I use that a lot on Yodo and Shikuma. Or you could have a defensive AA. Obviously, there's not a lot of anti-aircraft guns here, so it would kind of be like Okitsushima anti-aircraft defense, where you pop it and you scatter planes, but if you actually shoot one down, it's a miracle. But yeah, it'd be a pretty fun ship. I really actually like this ship historically. It's just a really interesting design, and I love the way it looks. I could definitely see it being used in game as well. And there's a picture of her. But as you can see, just everything back from the main tower, there's nothing there. It's just free damage. So she would be a danger ship with the amount of aircraft she would have. But if you actually catch her and damage her, she'll go down really quick. Our next up is Hagiro. This is one of the Miyoko class cruisers. I would have this ship be at tier 7. 36 knots, 5 twin 203mm or 8-inch guns, 4 twin 127mm secondaries on the amidships, and 4 triple 24-inch torpedo tubes. This is your standard Miyoko class cruiser that we already have in the game. However, the difference would be in her consumables. So Hagiro is kind of infamous for being the last heavy ship, I guess you could say, to be sunk by destroyers. She was sunk by a bunch of British destroyers in a night action. And so that actually plays into her consumables, I would say. So the first consumable would be normal repair, second would be heal, and the third one would be a mix of 3 options. You could either have defensive AA, which is what the in-game Yoko already has. You could either have Torpedo Reload Booster, because that would be interesting. Or you could have a Hydroacoustic Search, because since she was sank by torpedoes, giving her an ability to detect the torpedoes in advance would be a kind of ironic way of having the ship in the game. So gunfire and gun power, you're not much different. Torpedo power, same kind of setup. Anti-aircraft, you could add a few more guns on there if you wanted to, or you could just leave it the way it is. The main difference is the way her consumables are. So yes, it's a copy-paste ship to a degree, but the actual consumables that you'd be able to use would make the ship stand out versus the normal Miyoko already in the game. Especially if she had Hydro. I would use Hydro over defensive AA any day, because the Miyoko doesn't have enough anti-aircraft power to actually make a real difference. Torpedo Reload Booster, this one was just kind of there for laughs. You only have rear firing torpedoes, but if you're running away from something and you launch all your torpedoes and you torpedo Reload Booster and do it all again, that could be pretty interesting. But it would be hard to use that offensively if you're like rushing down a ship, because then you have to give broadside and you have pretty trash armor if someone shoots you on the broadside. So yeah, you'd have to play it smart, but for laughs and giggles, who knows, it might be fun. And this is a picture of her. And the last cruiser we have is a Mogami CV conversion. So 1943, the Mogami class heavy/light cruisers underwent a program to turn the back of the ship into half of an aircraft carrier. This had limited to no success, honestly, in the war, but you can make it a little bit better in game. So again, similar to Nishin, this would be kind of like a super Oyoto. This ship would also be at tier 8, which is where Oyoto is, so she has to have something that makes her stand out. And I have just the thing, but we'll get that in a second. So a speed of 35.5 knots means she's really fast on her feet. We have 3 twin 8-inch guns in the front of the ship, as you can see there. We have 4 twin 127mm secondaries amidships, and it says it actually still has its 4 triple 24-inch torpedo tubes, as you can see here, amidships. So you still actually have a lot of your firepower. You're only missing 2 8-inch twin gun mounts, and those are within the stern. Now, I always run my Mogami with my 6.1-inch 155mm guns, because that just makes sense to me. If I want to play a ship that's like Mogami with 8-inch guns, I'll just play a Buki, because that's pretty much the same thing. However, the difference is the back of the ship, where you can carry 11 aircraft. Now, I would make this special because Oyoto can already carry torpedo bombers, and Chikuma can already carry dive bombers. Now, let's say you want to give Mogami dive bombers. Okay, well, then you would just play Chikuma, because you get 2 more guns, and you still keep all your torpedoes and everything like that. Okay, well, what about torpedo bombers? Well, yes, you get more gun power than Oyoto, but Oyoto is small and is easier to play, kind of, versus Mogami in a supporting role. So I would say you could give her the option of having either torpedo bombers or dive bombers, have the player choose, and then that would make her just special enough that you could also get Shikuma if you wanted more gun power. But let's say you liked the way Oyoto played, but you don't think she was strong enough, you could get the Mogami CV conversion and have her run with torpedo bombers instead. That way you would have like a Shikuma base with dive bombers and a Mogami base with torpedo bombers. So you would lose a little bit of your gunfire by only having 3 twin turrets, but you would also have the torpedo bomber capability, which on paper is actually stronger than the dive bombers, if just not as accurate. So I think Mogami CV with torpedo bombers or dive bombers would be a good complement to Oyoto and Shikuma, which are already in the game. And this is kind of what she would look like there. It looks very busy, I guess you could say, but I think the ship would work fairly well. And it'd be a nice addition because Mogamis are always fun. I love Mogamis. All right, that is it for the cruisers. Next, on to the battleships, and we are just redoing the same exact thing because next we have Issei 1943 battleship carrier conversion. After Midway, a lot of Japanese ships were converted into half carriers. This is just another one. So Mogami was the last one we were looking at, had the same kind of idea as Issei. Issei would be a tier 6 battleship. So along with Fuso, 25 knots, 4 twin 356mm guns, so 14-inch guns. Same with Congo and Fuso, except Fuso would have 2 more additional turrets. The gun angles for these guns would be a little bit different, as the middle turrets would not be able to fire directly astern. They would only have side shots. So if you attack the ship from behind, or if it runs away, it would have no way of really defending itself. Which is unfortunate, but you would also have to play the ship smartly so you would not end up in that situation to begin with. You would also have 8 twin 127mm guns. So if you notice, all the casemates are actually covered. So Fuso gets the casemates, but Issei does not. You have a bunch of the twin 127 mils. You have 6 of them on the main tower and then 2 of them next to the funnel. These would count as your large caliber AA and your secondaries. So as secondaries, it's actually not terrible because 127 mils, high explosive, can do quite a bit of damage to a destroyer if it gets close enough. So that would be a pretty okay secondary battery. You have nothing in the stern though. So again, if you run down this ship from the stern, or if it runs away, there's no way of shooting back. Limited small arms anti-aircraft defense. I didn't really focus on AA on any of these ships, but you know, it would still have some. No torpedoes, but it would have 22 aircraft, or at least that's historically what it had. I would want these to be dive bombers. So Nishin would also have dive bombers or torpedo bombers. Issei at tier 6, tier above Nishin, would have just straight dive bombers. You could argue that Agano would no longer have a role with her dive bombers because as a 6.5, she could also be tossed into tier 6 games, but she only has 2 dive bombers, and honestly, I don't even use them because they get shot down before they can drop anything. But Issei dive bombers would be fairly easy. So you could stay at long range, potentially have increased accuracy with the ship as well, considering you have a limited number of main guns, considering you're also at tier 6. So you could stand back, use your increased accuracy, and you could also use your dive bomber squadrons to attack targets at those ranges as well. I think she would be a fun ship. A lot different than what we normally see with Japanese battleships, but also not so different from ships we already have in the game that she would be unplayable. These squadrons that I've been talking about for the last few ships would not be player controlled. Like I said, it would just be like Oyodo or Kitsushima, where you just launch the aircraft, you select a target, and you press attack, and the plane goes and does its thing. And you have no input over how it drops or where it drops or anything like that, so you kind of have to play it smart. But honestly, I think she could work. And I'm surprised she's not already in the game, believe it or not. For consumables, the first one would be heal. Well, second one technically would be heal. First one would be repair. And the third one would be seaplane servicing time, so you could cut down the reload of your aircraft, just like Oyodo or Shikuma. And she would also have a defensive AA. Or I should say, she could have a defensive AA in place of seaplane servicing. You don't have a lot of anti-aircraft defense, so I don't think this would be too overpowered. You would scatter the squadrons because you are such a large target. You might knock down 4 or 5, but it's not going to be so overpowered that you're just going to shred squadrons left and right. You don't have a lot of AA on the ship at all. But I think she would be fairly fun, and that's also kind of what she would look like as well. And then next, we have Musashi, 1944, or 42. Now, I'm sure everyone's saying, why do we need yet another Yamato in the game? I kind of agree, yes. We already have the normal Yamato, we have Yamato Refit, we have Super Yamato, we have the White Lotus Yamato, and if you count all the different sister ships and everything like that, there's even more then. However, there's one more I think we could use in the game, and that is the 1942 version of Yamato. So this is before she gets all of her additional anti-aircraft guns on the amidships. She would have all four of her triple 155mm secondaries. So the two normally where they are, super firing Bravo and Charlie turret. But we would also have two amidships next to the funnel. Now, as her stats, she would actually be a tier 8 battleship. Now, mind you, 18-inch overmatch still doesn't quite exist in the game, so she would fit right in at tier 8. 27.5 knots, 3 twin 18-inch guns. You'd have 4 triple 155 mils, and then she also still has 6 twin 127 mils. You can see them there. So not as many 5-inch guns, but more 6-inch guns. No torpedoes, and she would have a heal and defensive AA as her consumables. Now I say defensive AA because at tier 8, the carriers are pretty strong. You have Lexington, Saratogas, Enterprises, Kagas, Akagis, you name it, list goes on. And every single one of those carriers will just eat this battleship up. It's a large target, not very fast, less maneuverable. You can see she's absolutely massive, so dive bombers are going to have a field day with her. And since it's Yamato with not a full anti-aircraft build, her numbers are going to be pretty poor, if anything. She might have the lowest anti-aircraft rating of tier 8, believe it or not, and I wouldn't be surprised by that. So adding a defensive AA would help you scatter some ships, aircraft, but not necessarily knock them down. So you would still take a lot of damage from aircraft, but you could try and mitigate that just a little bit with defensive AA. And I think this ship would be pretty good at tier 8. Now, if they ever fix the overmatch mechanic for the 18-inch guns, then she might be a little bit too overpowered. You might want to make her like an 8.5 or something like that, so she's more or less tossed into 9.0 games. However, the way it works now, I'd say she'd be fine. And that is it for battleships. Next, we have two more carriers to go over that I think could work. First one is Junyo. I would have Junyo be at a 5.9 matchmaking, so tier 6 with Roiho. 25.5 knot speed. 6 twin 127mm gun secondaries, so not much different than Roiho already. And 53 planes total. Now, you might think that's actually a lot, but the ship itself is pretty slow. So if you actually catch her, then yeah, she's not going to go anywhere. She actually will be hard pressed to outrun some battleships. Like Fuso can probably run her down, or just about. The British battle cruisers definitely can. But her thing would be consumables. So she would have defensive anti-aircraft. So she would only have one of those. She would also have frontline station. So that's the one where you click it and every squadron that's currently reloading would immediately have its reloading time shortened or cut down by a certain amount. We already kind of see this on Robin, I believe it is. So if you remember that video, I had advised of clicking that consumable immediately at the beginning of the battle. That way you get your planes out just a little bit faster. But besides that, I don't really see what the use of that consumable is. But this ship is pretty much the same thing as Reiho, just a little bit different. Adds a little bit of flavor to tier 6 because tier 6 doesn't have a lot of carriers. So adding a special one, kind of like how we have Zoiho already at tier 3-ish. I forget. But yeah, just adding a little bit of flavor, making it a little bit different. You could adjust the squadrons, so maybe she's more offensive than Reiho, or maybe she's more defensive with more fighters. Who knows? You can adjust it however you want, but Junior would be a pretty interesting carrier to add. And the next one, and oh, there's a picture of her. The last special Japanese ship I think we could use in the game is Unrio. So this is an improved Shokaku class. So before Taiho, but after Shokaku. 34 knot speed at tier 8, so she would also be next to Shokaku, Kaga, and Akagi. Though I could also see her at tier 9, honestly. 6 twin 127mm guns, so no real difference there in secondaries, but again, you're a carrier, doesn't really matter. 65 planes. Now this is why I'm pretty sure I put her at tier 8, because 65 planes is not a lot at the high-end tiers. So if you go at tier 8 with Saratogas and Lexingtons, Kagas, you're looking at between 80 and 90 planes, sometimes more than that. If you go up to tier 9, you have Essex, which has over 100 planes, and the other ships, carriers, don't really have that much, but they still have quite a bit. So only having 65 would mean that you're always going to be outplaned no matter what carrier you face. You're actually pretty similar to a British carrier, if anything. You just don't have the armored deck. You're still just a normal Japanese carrier. So, to help alleviate that, you give her 2 defensive anti-aircraft suites, or consumables, because Victorious also has 2 of them. And then you would also give her 1 heal. So kind of like how Enterprise has a heal. She's the only carrier with a heal right now, if I remember correctly. But you could also give Unrio a heal, because if you're going to not have a lot of planes, you're not going to have a lot of way of defending yourself. She may be more offensively based carrier than defensively. So if you have limited carriers or fighters, you're going to take damage. So if you can heal that, you can still be in the fight a little bit longer than normal. And I think that would be a pretty good addition to the carriers. Now, Japan already has a lot of carriers. I don't think they need too many more, so that's why I only have the couple there. There's still obviously carriers to choose from, but I think those 2 would be good additions to the game. And with that, that would wrap up Japanese special ships that I think would be beneficial to adding in the game. All right, the next country we have for special ships is the United States. We already have quite a few special ships for the United States already in the game. Don't get me wrong, they are all wonderful ships, but I feel like we could add some more. We have a bunch of destroyers, cruisers, a lot more battleships, and a handful of carriers we could add as well. Now I do know I mentioned we would want more cruisers and destroyers in the game because there's already so many battleships. However, these are pretty low tier ones, which we don't have nearly as many low tier battleships as high tier battleships. So it kind of works its way out there. So let's just go over these real quick so you can see, you can read all of these, but I will be going over all this information as we look at the pictures. And these are the ships I think we could use. Feel free to pause and read these from there. Okay. First destroyer would be USS Smith. Now, Smith is a really low tier destroyer at tier 2. Should have a speed of 28 knots, 5 single 76mm guns, and 3 single 450mm torpedo tubes. Now I know what you're thinking, that's a garbage ship. And on paper, yeah, that is pretty weak for a ship. Samson will outdo that in every single battle. She has better guns, she has better torpedo tubes. I don't think she's as fast though. But regardless, Smith, she actually has a pretty fun playstyle. I do have Smith on my World of Warships account that I no longer play, and I had quite a few fun games. The guns, less than ideal, 76mm. You're pretty much just a Tachibana at that time, or a Sakura, depending on how you want to address her. So you're going to shatter with high explosive a lot, and armor piercing is just going to overpen a ricochet. However, you still have guns. 3 single torpedo tubes. You have 2 on each beam and 1 directly astern. They make for pretty fun YOLO rushes because single torpedo tubes would reload exceptionally quickly. I'm thinking like maybe 10 seconds or 15 seconds, maybe. and you would just rush at the enemy, pop a couple torpedo tubes, and by the time you get back to the other side, the first torpedo you launched is already reloaded, and then you would just go back and forth, and then you have the one on the stern when you pass by. Like I said, a lot of fun games with her. But yes, on paper, her armament is a lot weaker than Samson. For consumables, you would have smoke and a speed boost, just generic torpedo or destroyer ships and consumables. There she is. Next, we would have USS Johnston. It was a Fletcher-class destroyer that was lost in the Battle of Samar, an infamous last stand attempt by a bunch of American warships, one of them, the most notable, potentially being the Johnston. So she would have very similar firepower to a Fletcher. In fact, it's actually identical to a Fletcher, but her consumables are where she would stand out. So Johnston would have a speed of 36.5 knots, 5 single 5-inch guns, and 2 quintuple 21-inch torpedo tubes, exactly the way we have it already for Fletcher. However, she would have a smokescreen or a heel for her second consumable, and a French destroyer speed boost or a gun reload booster for her third consumable. Now, this would make her potentially very, very dangerous. She would lose her defensive AA capability, so her anti-aircraft defense would be a lot less, but she'd be more focused towards surface engagements and potentially could even hit above her weight class and get into gunfights with light cruisers or even heavy cruisers. The gun reload booster, again, it would take some work to adjust the consumable, but if you had a certain time frame of like 30 seconds or so where your gun reload is a lot less than normal, this ship would just be a rapid fire machine gun. It would be so fun. French destroyer speed boost, it would last was it 2.5 to 3 minutes or so? You just zoom around the map. It would affect your maneuverability, however, still. And then if you had a heal, you'd only have like 1 or 2 heals, so kind of like a Yudachi or Yukukaze heal. Not something insane like a French heal. But you would be able to soak up or get into gunfights with destroyers or so, soak up some damage, heal that, and then go back for more. So it would kind of be like a super Fletcher. So pretty interesting ship altogether. Next ship to go over is also a version of a Fletcher destroyer. However, this one does have some changes to its armament. So this would be the Kidd, USS Kidd. Only 35 knot speed, so you do drop a little bit in speed. 5 single 5-inch guns and only 1 quintuple 21-inch torpedo tube. Now, there's already a Fletcher in the game that only has 1 torpedo mount. That is the Halford. However, we trade that in and one of her 5-inch guns for catapult launcher and aircraft. In this case, you would trade your torpedo launcher for increased anti-aircraft defense, so more in guns. So she would pretty much play very similar to a Fletcher, however, just with limited torpedo firepower. However, those torpedoes would be fast torpedoes, so they'd be heading towards the enemy at like 70 plus knots or so. They won't have as much range as Fletcher, I would say, but you'd be able to actually land your torpedoes, albeit in limited quantities, because of how fast they are. Now, for consumables, you could either go with smoke or torpedo reload booster, because you only have that 1 torpedo mount. And for the third one, you could go with speed boost or a super defensive AA. So Cheyenne already has a super defensive AA in the game, so instead of the presumptuous increasing your anti-aircraft defense by 200%, it's 250%, so a lot higher. The same thing would go with Kidd. Now, as a destroyer, her base values are not going to be nearly as good as a light cruiser that's focused on anti-aircraft work, obviously. But as a destroyer with a lot of anti-aircraft guns and dual-purpose mounts, she would be able to knock down quite a few planes, honestly. I would expect her to be very, very good in the anti-aircraft role. The next ship and last destroyer we have for the Americans is the Forrest Sherman. The Forrest Sherman is a pretty modern ship. I would have her as a 9.6, so along with gearing and SOMARs. However, she would have a fairly different play style than both of those ships. Those are more focused on gun power and torpedo power. This one, a little bit different. So she is actually going to be pretty slow at 32 and a half knots. So you're going to be outrun by battleships, honestly. And you only have three single 5-inch guns, one in the front, two in the back. But these would fire sap shells, so semi-armor piercing, at an exceptionally high fire rate. You would actually be a straight-up machine gun, kind of like how Forrest Sherman is in World of Warships. Torpedo power, you only have four single 21-inch torpedo tubes on pretty terrible angles. But for consumables, that is where you would have a field day. Second one, you would have either smoke or hydroacoustic search. So you can either hide and machine gun, or you can hunt down destroyers and use your rapid firing guns to just melt them. And for your third consumable, you could either have a normal speed boost or defensive AA. Now, this ship has pretty impressive anti-aircraft abilities. If you can notice there's actually 3-inch guns right in front of the bridge. The same ones that you would find on Des Moines or Worcester or Illinois. Those would make her very, very anti-aircraft focused. Kind of like Kid, but not on such a high basis. So you would only have a normal defensive AA, but you'd have a rapid-firing sap shell guns, which would melt cruisers and destroyers. Torpedoes are not going to be the best. Potentially long-range, average torpedoes, but you only have 2 of them per side, so nothing exceptionally special. You're really focusing on your speed and your gunfire. Well, not speed, your anti-aircraft defense and your gunfire. You could potentially even give her radar if you really wanted to. However, I did not include that with this ship. Next, we go to cruisers, after we look at a picture of the real Forrest Sherman. Cruisers, we're going to start out with Tier 2. USS Albany. Now, Albany is kind of an interesting cruiser. She was an Ellswick cruiser from Britain. It was going to be sold to a South American country. I believe it was going to be sold to Brazil, but it was actually purchased by America. As a low-tier cruiser, nothing exceptionally special. 20 knots, 10 single 5-inch guns, and no secondaries, no torpedoes, not even any further consumables past a repair. However, she would still be a pretty fun ship, and at Tier 2, it would definitely be a better ship than Chester. Chester is just one of those god-awful ships. If you think Albany as a minced down version of St. Louis, so St. Louis would have the 6-inch guns, a lot more of them, and a lot better armor. Albany would have the similar playstyle, but with less guns and less caliber of guns. I think she'd actually be pretty fun. Again, I really want to see more special ships at lower tiers. There's just so many special ships at high tiers that some games you barely see any normal tech tree ships. But if you go to low tiers, all you see is tech tree ships and barely any special ships. Next, we would have Indianapolis at Tier 7. Now, surprisingly, we do not have a Northampton class cruiser in the game for the Americans. We have pretty much every single other cruiser class in the game, including Wichita, which was a one-off ship. But we don't have Northampton, which was pretty much the main backstay of the United States cruiser force in early World War II. So I decided to go around and see if we could add Indianapolis. Now, Indianapolis is obviously an infamous ship for the way she was sinking and for what she was carrying right before she sank. So at Tier 7, Tier 7, not Tier 8, because at Tier 8 we have Baltimore. When I wrote this up, New Orleans was also at a 7.5. That she has now been dropped down to a Tier 7, even though she's still tossed into 7.5 matchmaking games. But Indianapolis and Northampton in general is the cruiser class that came right before New Orleans, so that's why I have her at Tier 7. And she is also above Pensacola, which is a 6.5, which was her predecessor. So 32.5 knots, 3 triple 8-inch guns, 2 triples in the front, 1 in the back there. 8 single 127mm guns or 5-inch guns. Those are her secondaries on the aft superstructure there. Kind of just like how Brooklyn or New Orleans has that. No torpedoes. And she would have a repair. She would have a heal. She could either choose between radar or a defensive AA. Now, this would be the first Tier 7 ship with radar. And you know how I feel about radar. It's pretty much useless in the way I like to play. But I could definitely see it being useful in arena games or just normal PvP. Versus what I do is just I mess up bots all the time. But radar could potentially be useful, and as being the only ship with radar, that would make her stand out fairly well. Defensive AA, again, you're an American cruiser. I wouldn't think of not having a defensive AA on an American cruiser because of just the playstyle that the Americans had during the war. So you could just go generic and be a little bit worse off New Orleans, but you also have the history aspect in that as well that would make her fairly interesting. There's a picture of her. Next up, we have another Tier 7 special ship, San Diego. Yes, we already have Atlanta in the game. I understand that. She is a 6.0. Yeah, 6.0 matchmaking light cruiser. Now, San Diego, I would have her as a Tier 7. Now, why would I have her as a Tier 7? Well, we'll get there in a moment. But, pretty much, you are going to be a normal Atlanta. You have 32.5 knot speed, 8 twin 5-inch guns, so the same kind of layout as an Atlanta. And you also have the 2 quad torpedo tubes that you don't normally find on American light cruisers. However, your consumables are what are different. So you would have your normal repair, you'd have your heal, and then for your third consumable, you could either have a radar, so same as Indianapolis, or a defensive AA. So pretty much the same there as well. However, you could also give her a super defensive AA and make her a Tier 8. So increase anti-aircraft firepower and stuff like that. So the San Diego is actually a pretty infamous ship as well. I'm not entirely sure what the reason was for. It's been a while since I wrote down the ship. But there was she was pretty notable in her life as a warship. You could go a step farther to make her worthy of being a higher tier by giving her sap shells. I believe I originally was going to, I just never actually wrote it down to remind myself of that. So having a higher tier Atlanta with sap shells would be very interesting. And then with her improved anti-aircraft defense, she would be pretty notable. So Tier 7, the light cruisers you have already for America are Brooklyn and Helena. Those focus more on firepower in the form of 6-inch guns, 15 of them to be exact. This ship would be different because it would focus on anti-aircraft. And Tier 7 is where we really start seeing some dangerous carriers. So, sap shells, anti-aircraft, and like I said, if you make her a Tier 8 with a super defensive AA, that would make her very interesting as well. Cheyenne, the souped-up Atlanta, is an 8.5 with a super defensive AA. So she'd still be below that, and Cheyenne would still be an improvement, and then Worcester is an improvement upon Cheyenne. So you wouldn't mess up the balance anywhere with that either. And she still gets torpedoes, which is fun. Next up, we have, well, there's another San Diego there. Minneapolis. So this would be a New Orleans class cruiser that would have a little bit of an adjustment with her consumables. So you would have your normal New Orleans hull. You have 32.5 knot speed, 3 triple 203mm guns or 8-inch guns, 8 single 127 mils, the same old, same old. However, you would have a heal as your second consumable, and either a Hagiro or a gun reload booster for your third consumable. No defensive AA. Now I say that because I'm pretty sure I have the picture here. Yep. Her bow was blown off by a torpedo, and it knocked the entire front of the ship off down to the very front turret. So if you actually look at how much of the ship that is, that's quite an exceptional amount. So similar to how I had the mentality for Hagiro, give her Hydro so she'd have better ability to detect torpedoes so she doesn't end up like that. And then for giggles, make her just a little bit better by giving her a gun reload booster as well. New Orleans itself is a pretty frail ship if you don't play her correctly. She's a large target. She doesn't have a lot of armor, and if you hit her with anything larger than a 5-inch gun, and even sometimes with a 5-inch gun, you can citadel her, and she'll go down pretty quickly. So, giving her a limited lifespan, the ability to dish out as many shells as she can with a gun reload booster would make her a little bit more of a threat. And who knows, it might work. I know I'd like to have a New Orleans with a gun reload booster. It's just something that is just different enough that I think could be fun. And Hydro, so you don't look like that. And if you don't want the gun reload booster and you want to have the Hydro, then you're better equipped to deal with torpedoes and destroyers. So you can rush towards smoke screens and hopefully detect destroyers or torpedoes. Just a little bit more universal use of this ship versus the all-American just anti-aircraft. That's what I am, anti-aircraft. So I'll give her a little bit more flexibility there. Same thing would go with our next and final special cruiser. At tier 8, we would have Birmingham. Now this is a Cleveland class cruiser, and she kind of has a pretty sad history, especially in one instance where she was firefighting a burning carrier. She came up beside and assisted with firefighting procedures and tactics, and then the carrier itself had explosions right next to the ship itself, and it pretty much just wiped out most of the crew and destroyed the top sides. Pretty sad event, actually, if you look it up. And so I've adjusted that with her consumables as well. But for her main stats, same thing as a normal Cleveland at tier 8, 32.5 knot speed, 4 triple 6-inch guns, 6 twin 5-inch guns for secondaries, and dual purpose AA. And so the first consumable you would have is a normal repair. So you would have your fire extinguisher, you would be able to stop flooding, so on and so forth. The second consumable would either be another repair party, so kind of like the dual repair party we have for Warspite and the one that they tried for the American battleships, but it didn't quite work. By having a double repair party would fall in line with her event that the ship itself was pretty much blown up by the burning carrier. So you'd be able to repair fires more often. Or in place of that second repair, you would have a heal. Just a normal heal, the one that Cleveland already gets. For your third consumable, you could either get defensive AA, such as any normal American cruiser would get, or you could get hydroacoustic search. So that would make her a very, very strong destroyer hunter, because you would have your hydro and you would also have your rapid firing 6-inch guns, which are already amazing against destroyers. But I think that would make her pretty interesting. And then having the double repair kind of is a shout out to her event where she had pretty severe damage from the burning carrier there. Just a really notable event, honestly. And there she is. All right, now we are into battleships. We're halfway there. First one is kind of a follow-up to a few ships we already have in the game. So this would be a 2.2 matchmaking battleship. Now, low-tier battleships, we have Mikasa at 2.0. We have Danton at 2.0 as well. Those are all pre-Dreadnought battleships. We also have Kawachi at 2.2, which technically, historically, is between a pre-Dreadnought and a Dreadnought. She had the same caliber guns, or the same size guns, but the caliber were different in terms of barrel length. So technically the guns were different. It's an ongoing argument. Honestly, I like to think of her as the first Dreadnought. But as a 2.2, she sees battle in 2.0 and actually 3.0 games. And so for this next ship, that's kind of what I would want to see as well. And that is South Carolina, the first American Dreadnought. Now, the ship itself is going to be pretty garbage on paper, don't get me wrong. However, I still think she would be a fun, like, event ship or something like that, because we already got Mikasa and Danton as event ships. What's to say we can't get one more? So, South Carolina, as a 2.2 matchmaking ship, has a speed of 18.5 knots, so dreadfully slow. 4 twin 12-inch guns, pretty decent firepower, and the layout is actually a lot better. So, versus something like Danton, where you only have 2 twin 12s, or Mikasa, which also has 2 twin 12s, you actually have 4 twin. And then on the broadside, you have the same amount of firepower as a Kawachi, even if Kawachi has 6 guns, or 6 twin guns. Secondary, she has 22 single 76mm guns, or 3-inch guns. So I already mentioned 76mm guns, they are going to just shatter a lot with high explosive. But you know what? Why not have a secondary brawler at tier 2.2? We already have Nassau, which is pretty good. Dreadnought's potentially even better. But those are all tier 3 ships. Why not have one at tier 2? Just for laughs. I mean, they're 76mm guns, they're going to shatter a lot, but I like seeing those secondary hits regardless. And for consumable, she would only have a single heal and her repair. Nothing special other than that. But it'd be fun. I mean, we already have a lot of battleships in the game for America. What's one more? And honestly, this one was a pretty impressive and important one in American history as well. Next, we have Tier 5 USS Texas. Now, Texas is kind of a special ship. She's the sister ship to USS New York, which is already in the game at Tier 5. However, Texas had an upgrade, or a rather serious upgrade, to her anti-aircraft defense all throughout the war, ending up with a ton of anti-aircraft guns. As you can see here, she's just absolutely covered in them. So you can kind of see where this is going. Tier 5, she would have the same speed of 21 knots, so god-awfully slow. 5 twin 14-inch guns, so she still keeps the same firepower. She would have no secondaries, actually. No secondaries at all. And she would have a repair, a heal, and she would get a defensive AA. Now, Tier 5 carriers are not necessarily the strongest, so honestly, there's not much to worry about them. However, for the way she is, you would be able to give her a defensive AA and she would knock down every single plane that came across her. Now, you could equal this out by having either a long reload for her defensive AA consumable, or just not having the defensive AA consumable at all and just making her anti-aircraft base stats a lot higher than the normal ship. So I would say like New Mexico stats at tier 6, but for a ship at tier 5, because the ship itself, Texas, doesn't fit in at tier 6. She's just going to be way too underpowered to take on those ships at that tier. But she has the anti-aircraft defense of ships higher than her. So any carrier is going to want to avoid her like the plague. And she's still going to have enough firepower to take on anything that comes across her. But with no secondaries, she can't really get that close. So I think she would be a really fun ship. Definitely one that I enjoyed playing in World of Warships. And it's also one of the ships that my favorite author, or one of my favorite authors, served on. So I really like this ship. Next is Oklahoma. Now, there may be some controversy with the next couple ships because of their personal histories, but I still think that they deserve some love and some light in the spotlight here. So Oklahoma, I would also have tier 5, so the same as New York and Texas. However, Oklahoma is actually a little bit slower at 20.5 knots, so you're still crawling around at god-awful slow speeds. And you have 2 triple, and you have 2 twin 14-inch guns. So you still have 10 guns, they're just in a different layout. So you still have the same firepower as New York and Texas. So there's no real difference there. That's why I still have her at the same tier. On this one, you do get 12 single 5-inch guns. These are all casemates. Really not that impressive, but I mean, you know what? They're there. And then you would just get a heal. So the main thing with this one is her historic, the history behind the ship, because Oklahoma is one of the most famous ships, sank at Pearl Harbor. She rolled over, capsized, pretty terrible story if you actually look into it. I still get chills watching the footage when you hear like the tapping on the hull and everything from people trapped inside. But the ship itself is pretty infamous, and you know what? Put her in the game so she can give the Japanese a little bit more damage back than she was able to. And with the same kind of gunpowder as New York and Texas, she'd fit right in, honestly. And she even has a little bit better layout. Just a heal, no special consumables for her either. Next is going to be a very famous ship, Arizona. This one would be her 1941 version, so not Pennsylvania refit. I did think about it, but I wanted to keep the original Arizona the way she was when the war started. So 21 knots, 4 triple, 14-inch guns, so the same kind of layout as New Mexico. That's why I have her at tier 6. 12 single, 5-inch guns. Again, pretty similar to Oklahoma, just not a lot of secondary firepower. And then she would have the first consumable be repair, second consumable also be repair, so she would have the double repair that we already have for Warspite, and then she would have a heal for her third one. So a more survivability build than anything when it comes to Arizona. But I think that she should also be in the game just for historical value, honestly. Next, we have a tier 8 battleship. After we look at a picture of Arizona, we have California. Now, you may already look at this ship and say, wow, we almost have that ship exactly with West Virginia. Yes, you'd be pretty close. This is a very similar layout to West Virginia. However, West Virginia has 4 twin 16s. This one would have 4 triple 14-inch guns at tier 8. So, yes, lower caliber, but you have more guns. Now, as California, though, she was the last class of battleship in the American Navy to actually equip 14-inch guns. So, to help rectify that, I would have these guns be fairly accurate in long range firepower. So 21 knot speed, again, tier 8, you're not going to go anywhere fast. 4 triple 14 guns, very accurate guns, however. 8 twin 127 millimeter guns, so the same kind of secondaries as West Virginia. And then you would get a repair, a heal, and a defensive AA. At tier 8, we've already talked about this, the carriers do get very strong, so having defensive anti-aircraft firepower would be beneficial, especially with a fat, slow target like this. The carriers are going to love you. So giving you as much defensive firepower as possible will help you out. And there she is. Next we have kind of a two fantasy ships, I guess you could say. So the first one was a follow-up, or actually I shouldn't say, a predecessor design for the North Carolina class. So back when the Americans were still following the London Naval Treaty, or the Washington Naval Treaty, whichever one it was, the gun caliber max was 14-inch guns. Now, obviously, there was ways of getting around this by just completely ignoring the treaty, but originally, the United States was going to follow through with the 14-inch guns. Now, they already had ships, as we just mentioned, the California, Arizona, New Mexico, they already had a bunch of 14-inch guns. So they wanted to make it a little bit better, and one of the designs for the North Carolina had quad 14-inch guns, but they were built in a way that you could remove the quad 14s and you could fit a triple 16 in the same barbette. So that was their way around it, so not much altering to the design work would have to be made once the North Carolinas were actually being built and they were equipped with the 16-inch guns. So you're going to kind of have yourself a mini Alsis, I guess you could say, except it's with 14-inch guns and it's at tier 8. So you're going up against like Richelieu and Gascogna. But you would have a speed of 27 knots, 3 quad 14-inch guns, 6 twin, 4 single 5-inch guns. So you have a mixed secondary battery, but they're all the same kind of guns. And then, yeah, there's a kind of a better picture where you can see the twins and the singles on the amidships there. And for consumables, she would have a repair. And then the second one would either be a heal or a gun reload booster. Now this one I'm kind of hesitant on because that would kind of make her very, very strong at tier 8. However, 14-inch guns at tier 8 means you're already going to be at a disadvantage no matter what. And having to choose between actually repairing the damage to your ship or inflicting more damage upon the enemy, I feel makes it fairly even. So either you can have the heal, potentially 4 heals for this ship, or the gun reload booster, which means you would be able to tish out a lot of damage with 14-inch guns. And then for the third consumable, speed boost, because you have a pretty slow speed, or defensive AA. Now, your defensive AA or your AA capability would not be nearly as good as normal Massachusetts or South Dakota or North Carolina. It'd be pretty average or slightly above average. But having a defensive AA means you'd be able to knock down more planes and even scatter squadrons. So I think this would be pretty good. Honestly, I'd love to see this ship added into the game. It's one ship that I never played in World of Warships, but I've always wanted to. And so I think she has a place here. And then lastly, we have Constellation. Now, this was what the Lexington and Saratoga class were going to originally be, which was battle cruisers. And you're pretty much just a souped up Colorado, pretty much. So you at tier 8, you would have 33 knot speed, 4 twin 16-inch guns, 10 twin 5-inch guns, and in the game they had 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes in World Warships. You could also have that on here, but honestly, it's really up to the game developers. They might be a good last-ditch component, but you might as well just leave them off as well. No special consumables. You would have repair, heal, and speed boost. But this was originally, well, not this exact version, but the Constellation class battlecruisers were going to at least have the main armament of 4 twin 16-inch guns, but this is like a modernized version, or how they would be had they actually been built as battlecruisers and then modernized for World War II. So it'd be nice to see those as well, just to kind of get a feel of an American battlecruiser, because we don't have any, and I don't count Alaska. And that would be it for the battleships. Next, we have 3 carriers to go over. The first one is a Tier 7 USS Wasp. Now, Wasp is kind of a special case. She's fairly similar to the Yorktown class and Enterprise, which are already in the game. However, she is a budget version of those. So she kind of has the same characteristics, but she doesn't have nearly as much firepower or strength as those tier 8 ships. That's why she's at tier 7. So she has a speed of 29.5 knots. Secondaries, 8 single 5-inch guns, 2 on each quarter of the ship. But she has 76 planes, which is a fairly substantial amount. However, the ship itself is not well armored at all. In fact, she was hesitant to be used in the Pacific because of how easily she would succumb to damage. And historically, she actually was. She got hit by 1 or 2 torpedoes and she immediately went down. So, very weak ship overall. So, she has to have a lot more firepower in terms of aircraft to help mitigate that. And no fancy consumables other than a repair and 1 single defensive anti-aircraft. And then just normal tier 7 aircraft as well. Nothing special. Same thing that Ranger uses, I feel, would be just fine. Next, there's a picture of her. And then we have USS Saipan. Now, Saipan is an improved version of Independence class. So where Independence used a Cleveland hull, Saipan used a Baltimore hull, if I'm correct about that. At tier 7, she would go 33 knots. She has 0 secondaries, so no way of defending herself at all. Kind of like Aramanche, that's already in the game. No secondaries whatsoever. And she only has 48 aircraft. So again, not a lot. However, these would be pretty high-end aircraft. I'd say about tier 9. So something similar to what we have with like Majestic or Aramanche. You would take low-tier carriers, but give them high-tier aircraft just in small amounts. So kind of the same thing with the American Saipan here as well. and then a repair and 1 defensive anti-aircraft consumable. You can kind of see that here. And lastly, there's another one. We have Tier 9 Intrepid. So Intrepid is an Essex class carrier. She actually is a museum ship in New York City right now. I've really wanted to go see her. She's just a really impressive ship. Tier 9, she would have same capabilities as a normal Essex class, so 33 knots. Then she has 4 twin and 4 single 5-inch guns for self-defense. And then actually just exactly 100 aircraft. This could potentially just be a copycat ship, so similar to how Shinano is to Asano, or Malta is to Ocean, or the Ice Malta. You could have an Essex and an Intrepid. You can make her a Prism ship. Not that I would really care because she's a carrier, but for those of you who do like carriers, then having more high tier Prism ships would be nice. And you would make her a little bit better because she would have a repair, she would have 1 defensive AA, and she would have 1 heal. So kind of like how Unrio had the heal, you could also give Intrepid a heal as well. And there she is, Carrier CV-11. And that will finish up the special ships for United States that I think could be added to the game. Okay, the next country we are going to go over is France. We don't really have that many ships to go, or special ships for France. We already have a substantial amount considering the Navy they actually had during World War II and World War I. But there are a few additions I think we could add. So we are going to start out with the only special destroyer I think we could add. Well, we have Marceau, we have a couple of cruisers, 1 battleship, and 3 carriers. You can feel free to pause here and look at this, but I'll go over everything as we go along. So Marceau is a Mogador class destroyer, but with different consumables. So Mogador, as you know, is already a really, really strong destroyer. However, we can still improve upon that just a little bit more if we really wanted to. So we would have a matchmaking tier of 9.6, so top tier. We have a speed of 42 knots, 4 twin 139mm guns, so the same ones we already have on the ship itself. And then the torpedoes would stay the same as well. So 2 triple and 2 twin 550mm torpedo tubes. However, her consumables would be different. Instead of a heal, she could either get smoke screen or a gun reload booster, again with the altered gun reload booster mechanics. But having a smoke screen on this destroyer would make her kind of fairly interesting. Now, she does have the high speed, so you would have to slow down to actually use it and actually fully stop, which would take away her speed advantage. But if you are in a smoke screen, you don't have a citadel, and you have light cruiser guns, you can do a bunch of damage, honestly. Especially if you don't go with smoke and you just decide to keep your speed, gun reload booster, definitely going to be very, very strong. You can work over pretty much cruisers and battleships for 10 plus K in a few seconds, I would say. And then the third consumable would either be your normal French speed boost, which she already has, or defensive AA. Now, French destroyers aren't really known for their anti-aircraft. We have the T-47 and T-53, which are kind of better at it, but are lacking in a lot of other departments. This would mean you would have a fast ship with large caliber guns, heavy hitting torpedoes, and okay-ish defensive capabilities when it comes to aircraft. Though I haven't had an issue with aircraft when it comes to destroyers, but at least having it would be pretty interesting. But the main thing is you would lose that French heel. So you can't really YOLO as much. You're more of a support kind of vessel or longer range. So that's where that gun reload booster would come into play. That would definitely be very nice to have on this special ship. And having another Mogador would just be a dream come true, honestly. I love that ship so much. There she is in World of Warships. Though in this case, she would actually have, in this picture, she has the twin 127s that T-47 and T-53 have versus the 139s. So you could actually make an argument that instead of having the 139s, you'd give her the 127s and that's where she would get that improved anti-aircraft from. So it's kind of both ways. Yeah, I could see it. It'd kind of be like a better version of the T-53 there. You'd have more guns. You'd have torpedoes that are actually useful. You could make those even just normal torpedoes. Then gun reload booster with 127s. That would be pretty dang spicy, honestly. But yeah, lots of ways you can make this ship fun. There she is again. Cool. Next is a light cruiser, de Grasse. It's the last version of light cruiser that was going to be pretty much made for the French. So it's past, what is it? Emile Bertin, it's past La Galissonière. This would have been the improved version of La Galissonière. So at 7.5 matchmaking, so a little bit higher than La Galissonière at tier 7, but not quite as high as a tier 8 ship. She would still be tossed into tier 8 games, but she would be able to manage. So she's actually at the same matchmaking as Algerie that's already in the game. So you'd have a special heavy cruiser and you'd have a special light cruiser at the same tier. So it's nice. 33.5 knots speed, so pretty average speed. 3 triple 6-inch guns, 3 twin 100mm secondaries. So you can see them, they're in the back there, they're 4-inch guns. So kind of like a Richelieu kind of secondary setup. And 2 triple torpedo tubes of 550mm caliber. So pretty large torpedoes as well. Those would definitely pack a punch. You do only have a triple of them though, so you're not a torpedo ship. For consumables, you would have either a heel for your second consumable or a gun reload booster. So similar to the American one, what was it, Minneapolis, also at 7.5, you would have a gun reload booster for your guns. Now these are 6-inch guns, so you could get a little bit more out of it versus an 8-inch gun. But I still think a light cruiser with a reload booster, especially with a special one, would be pretty interesting. And then for your third consumable, you can either have defensive AA or a Hagiro, which is something you don't see on any other French cruiser, or at least Hagiro you do not see. So I think that would be pretty interesting as well, and that would make her stand out from the normal Algerie, and that would make her stand out from what's the other tiers? Well, you have La Galissonière and you have Suffren is the other one. So most of them have larger caliber guns, but this one would have rapid firing 6-inch. So it'd be pretty nice. There she is. There you can even give her the nice camo that she comes with in this picture. It'd be nice. Is it the same as this one? Kind of. And then the next cruiser we have is one I'm kind of hesitant on because I really don't like the playstyle of this ship. But I can also understand why some people would and why it could be a good addition to the game. That would be a tier 9.6 Colbert. This ugly duckling of a ship would be at tier 10. She has a speed of 33 knots. She has 8 twin 127mm guns. So if you actually kind of look at the gun layout, she has 3 on the center line. Well, technically 2 on the center line and then 2 on the wings, and that is replicated astern as well. So for a total broadside of about 6 guns, and if you angle just right, maybe 7 twin guns. Regardless, this is just an HE Death Rainbow ship, where it's kind of like Worcester, or it'd actually be pretty similar to Cheyenne, believe it or not. You would just have high angle, low shell velocity shells that would just rain down on enemy decks and superstructure. They wouldn't have a lot of pen, but if you had armor piercing or even high explosive, you would just rain major damage. They'd be rapid fire, so if you get close to any ship, it would do a ton of damage as well. First consumable would be a repair. Second one would be a speed boost because she has pretty slow speed. She can be outrun by battleships. And then for our third consumable, she could either have radar and be a full-fledged DD hunter, if she could catch them, or a super defensive AA. So again, similar to Cheyenne, she would just straight up knock planes out of the air. Now, if you notice, she does not have a heel. That is purposeful because you can't have a ship this strong and give it a heel as well. So you have strong guns that can wither away ships fairly easy. You're pretty much immune to carriers. Your small length of your hull means you have pretty decent maneuverability, even if you don't have great speed. But the size of your ship and your limited armor capability means that if your ship is seen and or shot at, it's going to be a very bad day because you will probably be one-shotted in most cases, if not just a big chunk of damage. So you do have to play pretty defensively, so either within smoke screens from your friendly teammates or behind islands and using cover and concealment as you see fit. Again, not really a fun play style for me. It's kind of like a souped up Atlanta, and Atlanta is really hard to hit targets at range. So you have to get close in order to do damage, but if you get close, then you have a higher chance of damage encountering you. So you have to find a happy middle ground there. Next, we're into battleships. We only have one French battleship that I think could be added to the game, and this is Lorraine 1944. Now, I have her as a tier 5, and she's actually a Britannia class battleship, which we already have Britannia in the game. It is the one after Corbeil. It is also a tier 5 ship, but the difference with Lorraine and Britannia is we are missing the central turret. So Britannia has 5 twin guns of 340mm caliber, whereas Lorraine only gets 4 twin 340mm caliber, but changes her or exchanges her middle turret for additional AA. So for secondaries, we still have the casemates of 14 single 139mm guns, and we also have 8 single 75mm guns. You can kind of see right there amidships. Only 21.5 knots, so still slow speed, but improved anti-aircraft capability. So this is like the French version of USS Texas, but maybe not to such an extreme level. Whereas we lose a gun turret and Texas does not, we still keep our secondaries, whereas Texas does not. We would have a repair, we would have a heal, and potentially you could add a speed boost or defensive AA for the third consumable. So you lose guns, your guns aren't nearly as big, but you get a speed boost, so you can actually outrun and be faster than Texas, so that would give you an advantage over that one. And you would still have a defensive AA, so you could still be able to knock down lots of planes. So you would lose some of your main firepower for more anti-aircraft defense. Now, again, tier 5 carriers, not necessarily that strong. That's why I'm adding, or not adding too many strong AA ships at tier 5. Just a couple battleships. And honestly, they're so slow that if you just wait out the defensive AA, or you have other ships destroy a lot of the AA guns beforehand, before the carrier attacks, you can still have no issue doing damage to these ships with carriers. Yeah, that would be the only battleship that I think we would be able to add, because we already have a lot of French battleships in the game. Next, we move on to carriers. Now, a couple of these are actually real. One is a design. The first one is actually a real ship at matchmaking 5.9. Actually, first is a picture of Lorraine as she was with her upgrade there. 5.9, we have Burn class carrier. This was actually a Normandy class battleship hull that was transformed into a carrier since the battleship was not going to be completed. At 21.5 knots, we have 8 single 155mm secondary guns. And believe it or not, she actually has torpedoes. 4 single 550mm torpedoes. They are on the broadside. You know what? Why not give a carrier torpedoes? I mean, it's 21.5 knots. She's not going to chase anything down, so if she's going to torpedo anything, it's going to be coming towards her, and at that point, they might as well deserve it. So, you know what? I think it's fine. Give the carrier torpedoes. It would make it for a really fun kind of ship. But for her main armament, she does have 40 aircraft. That would be, 40 aircraft. I don't know the stats for aircraft at this point. And then she would have a repair. She would have a defensive AA, one of them. And she could also have a speed boost. So maybe pushing her to like 25 knots, maybe. Again, she's a big fat target, pretty lightly armored, I would assume. So if she did think about YOLOing ships and torpedoing them, she's going to take lots of damage to do that. So, I mean, you have it as a backup, and for any unsuspecting ship that thinks they can just rush you down, it'd be kind of funny if you ended up getting a torpedo kill with a carrier from the carrier. I think that'd be kind of interesting. But yeah, so that's Bern. There she is. Next we have Joffre at tier 7. This was a planned ship, and I believe it actually was laid down as well. However, she was never actually completed because of, World War II. Tier 7, she'd have a speed of 33 knots. She has 4 twin 130mm secondaries and a bunch of other anti-aircraft mounts. And she also has 40 aircraft. So not a lot of planes, but they could potentially be pretty strong. You can make something out of their squadrons. She would have a repair, 1 defensive anti-aircraft consumable, and for her third consumable, speed boost or frontline station. So again, dropping down the reload time of your aircraft at the beginning of the game means you would have your aircraft out beforehand, and you would gain an advantage, at least in early battle. The carrier itself, though, pretty large target, probably not that armored, so if you're seen, you're not going to survive very long, and speed boost will help you get away, and unfortunately this one does not have torpedoes, so you can't really use those. There's a picture of how she may have looked like as well, had she finished construction. And then lastly, we have a tier 9 carrier that has actually already been previewed in a Naval Creed developer diary, but we just haven't seen the ship itself come out. And that would be a tier 9 Clemenceau, another French carrier. This one would be, again, at tier 9, so similar to Victorious is how I'm basing off the ship. Speed of 32 knots, 8 single 100mm guns for secondaries, dual purpose mounts at that. And then again, 40 aircraft. So we have the same amount of aircraft for all 3 carriers, except these one would be jets. Again, similar to Victorious on how she has her jet aircraft. So limited number of planes, but very strong planes when it comes to it. And then 2 defensive AAs, and you could either have a speed boost for your third consumable or 1 singular heal. So Victorious gets 2 heals, but this one you could either get 1 heal or a speed boost. And I think that would be very French-like. And there she is. Again, a real carrier. It'd be pretty nice to have another high-tier, somewhat super carrier. I mean, I don't really like carriers, but having them be very different from just, hey, I have hundreds of planes to manage, versus, hey, I have a handful of planes to manage, but they're super strong and can one-shot ships. I enjoy those kind of play styles for carriers. That's why I kind of like Lioning and Graf Zeppelin. You just one-shot everything you come across. And that will be it for French ships. So not too many special ships. 1 destroyer, a couple cruisers, 1 battleship, and a handful of carriers. But I think these are all just different enough that they would bring a lot of fun to the French line, more so than we already have with the ships that exist. Okay, the next country with special ships would be Germany. Again, we don't really have too many ships we can add here due to their limited navy size, but we do have a handful that I think could work. So we have a couple destroyers, a couple cruisers, a couple battle cruisers, and 1 carrier, believe it or not. So we're just going to go through all of those one at a time. First one is a destroyer at tier 5, S-113. Now, I found the ship when I was actually planning out the German destroyer tech tree line, and I wanted to add her, but there was no real way she would fit in that well. So I put her off to the side, and I'd love to see this ship as a special ship just because of her strange armament. So at tier 5, she has a speed of 34.5 knots. She has 4 single 149mm guns, so pretty dang big guns. Slow gun rotation, long gun reload, but they will citadel cruisers like no one's business. And torps are two twin, so not that many, but they're 600 millimeter torpedoes, so just short of 24-inch torpedoes at tier 5. I think that would be pretty interesting, honestly. So you have pretty much light cruiser guns and Japanese torpedoes primarily, or at least torpedo caliber. And I think that'd be pretty fun. Consumables, repair, the first one. Second one, you could either have smokescreen or torpedo reload booster, considering you only have 4 torpedoes. And then for the third one, you could either have a speed boost or potentially hydroacoustic search as well. Not that you're going to be that good of a destroyer hunter, but when your gun shells hit, they will hurt because of their large caliber. You would probably have the largest, let's see, tier 5. So we have Barask and Gnevny at 130 millimeter guns. So yeah, tier 5, you would have the largest caliber guns of 149 millimeter, and actually potentially the largest in the game at that point, because that's massive. Those are larger than light cruiser guns. So you'd have bigger guns than Kuma or Sendai, which are also near this tier. But again, I think would be a fairly interesting ship to play. Your rate of fire would be pretty trash, but it'd be a fun ship to play. Next, we have tier 10, the Spa Cruiser. Now, this is a potential German super destroyer, so a little bit stronger than Z-52 with her armament. We would have a speed of 36 knots, 3 twin 150 millimeter guns, so just short of 6-inch guns. They're 5.9s. 2 twin 88 millimeter guns potentially, so secondaries and or dual purpose AA. And then 2 quintuple 21-inch torpedo tubes. So this would be the only German destroyer with a quintuple torpedo mount, but you are also a massive ship that is pretty much a light cruiser without a citadel, but your detectability would be through the roof. And yeah, but it'd still be fun. Repair for the first consumable. Second would be smokescreen or a heal. You could get 2 or 3 heals, I would say, versus not getting any heals for any of the German destroyers. And then the third consumable could either be Hagiro, which is fairly stereotypical for German destroyers, or defensive AA. Since you're such a large target, who knows, maybe you want protection from carriers. I wouldn't necessarily think this would be a strong anti-aircraft destroyer, but you would still be able to knock down some planes. And having large caliber guns, 10 torpedoes, defensive AA, and a heal, you could be a very big thorn in the enemy's side, no matter what ship they're playing. And also, this is a very beautiful camo, and I really would want to see that in the game. And there's just another picture of it there. You see the twin guns there. All right, next we have cruisers. Tier 2, we have Emden. Now, technically, it's just a copy-paste Dresden. However, you could get advanced rewards or whatever like that. Just make her special. There is an Emden in World of Warships that has the fake funnel because Emden has a very interesting history during World War I. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend looking into it. It's one heck of a journey. Emden at tier 2 would have a speed of 23.5 knots, 10 single 4-inch guns, and for laughs and giggles, actually give her torpedo tubes of 2 single 450 millimeter torpedo mounts underwater on the broadside. Dresden does not have the torpedo tubes, so this would actually give Emden a little bit more firepower, and she would only have a repair. But there's Emden herself, and that's what she looks like with the fake funnel that we have in World of Warships. So again, just a fun little low tier ship. We already would have Aurora, which is in the game. We have Yatsen again in the game. Albany would be a potential addition. Why not have Emden as well? Add a few more special ships at lower tiers. And also give us the white camo. I love the white camo. And torpedoes, because it'd be interesting. It'd be kind of like Weymouth. You would have last shot torpedoes. That would be absolute garbage torpedoes, but it's still better than not having torpedoes. Next is Scharnhorst of 1905. Now, there's no real good way of naming these ships other than that, because the two ship names were Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, both of which are already in the game, and I don't want copycat names. So Scharnhorst of 05 is how I would address her. Uh, these are pretty famous ships as well, especially at the Battle of Coronel, where they were able to defeat a British squadron and then therefore get destroyed by British battlecruisers. Um, Again, a pretty impressive battle if you don't know it. Scharnhorst of 1905 would be at tier 3. Um, and there's a little bit of reasoning as to why that is because she's an armored cruiser. So she would fit in kind of with St. Louis. She has a speed of 22.5 knots, so pretty slow. Not going to get anywhere fast. You're a large target, easy to hit. Armor, probably just armored cruiser levels. You have 2 twin and 4 single 209mm guns. So just a tad larger than 8-inch. I think they're like 8.1s. Yes, that is a lot of firepower, but at tier 4, she's going to be pretty outclassed altogether because you wouldn't have an Omaha go up against something like this. So she fits in better as a tier 3 or even a 3.5. I would give her a 3.5 actually, now that I think about it. Secondary, she has 6 single 149mm guns and 13 single 88mm guns total between the two broadsides. So she's pretty much made out of guns. And if you wanted to, she also has 4 single 450mm torpedo tubes just to make things better. So yeah, definitely a 3.5 now that I think more about it. But a lot of gun power, even torpedo power, 0 anti-aircraft, I would say, or just about 0. And slow speed, large target, low armor means that she can hit targets, but she can't really soak up the damage that well herself. And at tier 3, or 3.5, she would face Invincible, which is already in the game, and that is one of the ships that actually sank her and her sister ship. So kind of the same layout there. She would get a repair and a heal for consumables, nothing other than that. And that was it for cruisers, believe it or not. There's not that many more we could add in the game that are not already in the game. So next we move on to technically battle cruisers. Oh, well, first there's a picture of Scharnhorst, and you can see her layout a little bit better there. And another picture of her. Next we go to Seydlitz, which is one of my favorite ships ever. Not really sure why, just always really like this ship. At a matchmaking tier 4.5, we would go at a speed of 26.5 knots. We have 5 twin 11-inch guns, 12 single 149mm guns, 12 single 88mm guns, and 4 single 500mm torpedo tubes. 11-inch guns are kind of low at 4.5, considering we would have Koenig, which would have the 12-inch at around the same tier. And then the layout isn't exactly stellar either, but it's better than a Nassau, but not so quite good as a Bayern or anything like that. So pretty good little battlecruiser there. We already have one German battlecruiser in the game. That's Ersatz York at tier 7. Again, don't really think she fits the best at tier 7, but you know, it works, I guess. And then for this ship, we would get a repair, a heal, and a speed boost for consumables. Nothing more special than that. But the ship is fairly infamous, and for a photograph of her as well. I'll get to that in a moment. That's right after this. This is a picture of the layout. So you have the one turret in the front, 2 on the wings, and then 2 facing astern. And then she is famous for having survived a massive amount of damage. So that's why I think she would have a place in the game as well. Next is Hindenburg, which is a follow-on version of a German battlecruiser at tier 5. 27 knots, so a little bit faster. 4 twin 12-inch guns, 14 single 149mm guns, and 4 single 88mm guns, and 4 single 600mm torpedo tubes. So we're faster, we have bigger guns. We don't have as many guns though, but they are in a better layout, similar to what we see on Ersatz York a couple tiers later. Secondaries are still there, so you could become a little bit of a secondary brawler if you really wanted to. And you have large caliber torpedo tubes, about 24-inch torpedoes. So you can make something of those as well, kind of like a repulse kind of version, except these would be underwater. You would have a heal and a speed boost for these consumables as well. And Hindenburg was the last, really, the most modern battle cruiser that the Germans had and used during the war, the First World War. Other ones that came along were either in different states of completion or just designs. There she is. And lastly, we have a carrier, Tier 5, Wesser, or Wesser, not quite sure how to pronounce that. 32 knot speed, 5 twin 105mm guns, but actually give her a fairly decent secondary battery at this tier. And then only 18 aircraft. So Tier 5, not a lot of planes, but they could be potentially fairly strong. And you would have one single defensive AA as a consumable. You can kind of see the layout here. I think we would need at least one or two more carriers for Germany versus just having Graf Zeppelin. But the only one that was practically almost completed was this one. There were a couple others that were in different states of completion, but I think we need a nice little low tier carrier as well. And who knows, having another secondary brawler would be fairly fun, even if it is just at tier 5. With that, that does finish up the German special ships that I think we could add in this game. Next country on the list for special ships is Italy. We only have a handful of ships here, actually only about 4. There's not really much we could add in terms of special ships for Italy, since they had kind of a small navy, and what wouldn't be covered already in the tech trees doesn't leave a lot. But we do have a handful of destroyers that we could add, and cruisers, and one carrier. Well, actually just battleships, one destroyer and one carrier. So you can take a look at this. We'll go over everything here in a moment. First one would be Leon at tier 6. So Leon is a kind of a special destroyer, tier 6. She would only have a speed of 34 knots, so fairly slow for a tier 6 destroyer, but she has 4 twin 120mm guns, which is a lot of firepower. Additionally, she has only 2 twin 21-inch torpedo tubes, so she's more of a gunboat versus a torpedo boat, and that's kind of reflected in her armament. But to give her a little bit more, she would have a repair as a first concealment or consumable, heal as the second one, so like 1 or 2 heals, and then either speed boost or torpedo reload booster for her last consumable. There we go. Speed boost because she's kind of slow, and torpedo reload booster because she doesn't have a lot of torpedoes, but there's no smoke screen at all. And I would give her HE and AP versus SAP. So she'd be more of a specialized gunboat for the Italians versus anything other than that. And this is another picture of how she looked. And here we go again. And next we have Tier 4 battleship Dante Alighieri, which is the first true Italian dreadnought ship that came out. 1914, it looks like. We have a speed of 23 knots, 4 triple 12-inch guns, 4 twin and 12 single 120mm guns, and 13 single 76mm guns for secondaries. So she's chocked full of secondaries and has a lot of firepower in her main guns. She's actually pretty similar to Russian battleships at this tier as well, for Ganga especially. And then if you really wanted to, she has 3 single 450mm submerged torpedo tubes as well. Again, torpedo tubes, they could easily be ignored if you so chose to, because the ship already has tons of firepower. She would have a repair and a heal for consumables. But as the first Italian dreadnought, pretty impressive and pretty important as well. And I think having her at a tier 4 would be a good place to have her at. And there you go. This is a picture from one of the warships, kind of showing you what she looks like. And then the next one is Francesco Caracciolo at tier 7. This ship was going to be pretty similar to Ersatz York, which is already in the game. It was kind of started construction on the same idea. So she has a 28 knot speed, 4 twin 381 or 15-inch guns, 12 single 152mm or 6-inch guns, and 8 single 102mm or 4-inch guns. She also has broadside submerged torpedo tubes of 8 single 450mm torpedo tubes. So 15-inch guns, pretty fast speed, lots of secondaries, including 6-inch guns, which do a fairly decent amount of damage. And if you give her 4 torpedoes per broadside, such as the Italian cruisers would have if the tech tree I provided is followed, she would also have the broadside torpedo tubes that they have. And then she would also have a repair, a heal, and a normal speed boost as well. This ship could be fairly dangerous, especially if you get close to her. But armor-wise, she would probably be fairly weak and be very easily citadeled, is what I would expect. So you would trade in your armor for additional speed and firepower. And this is kind of another layout of what that ship would look like. And next we get to the last special ship I could expect to see for Italy, Aquila, which is the one carrier that they almost completed, but did not. Aquila has a speed of 29.5 knots. I would also have her at tier 7. So again, tier 7 is the carrier tier that there's a lot of different stuff going on. I think Aquila would fit in very well there. We have 8 single 135mm guns for secondary, so she actually has a pretty decent secondary battery as well. It looks to be all in the back, however, believe it or not. So not quite sure how effective it would be in battle, but the numbers are there. Then she has 51 aircraft. So pretty okay amount, but they would potentially fall down fairly quickly, considering you would be going up against a few ships with pretty decent anti-aircraft defense. And then for consumables, she'd have a heal and 1 defensive AA. And you could give her a nice little camo, as you see here. And with that, that is surprisingly all the special Italian ships that I think could be added to the game. All right, the next country we have for special ships is Pan Asia. Now I only have 2 ships because again, Pan Asia doesn't have a lot of wiggle room with ships it actually had historically. There's a couple that I think could be added, 1 destroyer and 1 battleship / battle cruiser. But besides that, a lot of the special ships that are already in the game, actually all the ships that are Pan Asia are special ships, those are fit in fairly like what I would expect to see. So first off, we would have 1 destroyer, Chung Mu. It is a Fletcher class destroyer. Surprise, surprise. Let's not have another one in here at tier 9. Speed of 36 knots, 5 single 5-inch guns, firing sap shells. So that would be different than any other Fletcher class we would have in the game. 2 quintuple torpedo launchers, so the same, but these would fire deep water torpedoes. So again, kind of a more focused on large capital ships. And then she would have a repair for the first consumable, a Pan American heal for the second one, or a torpedo reload booster. So the Pan American heal is the one you would find on Fenyang. So you have 6 or 7 of them. They're pretty short duration, and they don't heal very much, but you'd have a lot of them. And then you could either have Pan American Speed Boost, again, something that Fenyang already has, or you could get a radar. And that's, again, something I don't think any other Fletcher ship has. So she would stand out by being different in that way. So sap shells, deep water torpedoes, Pan American heal, Pan American Speed Boost, and radar is what you would have for options. So fairly interesting setup that you don't quite see on any other Fletcher or any other destroyer for that matter. This is kind of what she would look like. And as a Fletcher, she would have pretty decent anti-aircraft as well, but maybe not the best, just normal Fletcher anti-aircraft. And then Tier 4, I could expect to see battlecruiser Yavuz. This is an ex-German battlecruiser that was handed over to Turkey. And remember, I'm counting Turkey as an Asian country for simplicity of tech tree formation, even though it is both Asian and European. Yavuz has a speed of 25.5 knots, 5 twin 11-inch guns, 10 single 149mm guns, 6 single 88mm guns, and 2 single 500mm torpedo tubes. So this is the direct predecessor of ships like Seydlitz. That's why I have Seydlitz at a 4.5 and Yavuz at a 4 to show that Seydlitz is a more advanced version of this ship, even though their armaments are pretty much identical. Seydlitz would have a little bit more armor and such as that. Speed as well, I believe. Actually, I can check. Yes. Seydlitz is an entire knot faster. So a little bit weaker, a little bit slower, a little bit less secondaries than Seydlitz, but you're also at a lower matchmaking, so you wouldn't run into her too often. At Tier 4, I'd feel like you'd fit in fairly well next to ships like Kaiser and Iron Duke and ships like that. You would have a repair, a heal, and a speed boost as well. All right, the next country we have special ships to go over is Great Britain. Surprisingly, there's actually not that many more ships I think we could add that are not already in the game. The British had a huge navy during World War II, but overall, a lot of the ships are already in the game already. There's only a handful I feel like we could add. A couple destroyers, a few cruisers, one battleship, and one carrier is what I have listed so far. You can take a look at those real quick. You can pause, take a look. I'll go over them again. All right, so for Tier 3, I think we could add Campbelltown. It's actually a Wickes/Clemson class destroyer that was transferred over to the British because they needed a lot of destroyers, and their armament was adjusted. Campbelltown is already in World of Warships, so we kind of have a basis to work on from there. Tier 3, she would have a speed of 35 knots. She only has 3 single 4-inch guns, so 1 in the front, 2 on the wings, nothing in the back. And then she only has 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes. Again, not the best, but these would have a lot longer range. I'm thinking like 9 or even 10-kilometer range, which is insane at Tier 3. So she'd kind of be more of a long-range torpedo ship. She would have British smoke as her second consumable, so the crawling smoke where you can go at half speed, and she'd also have a British speed boost, so the one that doesn't last long but recharges quickly, or she could have torpedo reload booster and send even more torpedoes downrange. At Tier 3, you're not going to be anything spectacular, but I mean, who knows? Maybe having a long-range torpedo ship at Tier 3 would be kind of fun. It's just that when it comes to her guns, she's not really that good, but at Tier 3 you don't really have a lot of good gunboat destroyers anyways, so she'll fit right in. A couple more pictures there. And next we have a Tier 8 destroyer. Now I'm sure you're saying, hey, every single British destroyer we get that's different or not in the tech tree is a Tier 8. We already have Legion, we have Lightning, we have Trafalgar. We have so many different Tier 8 British destroyers. Why do we need another one? Well, that's because we don't have this one yet, and this is the best tier where she fits. Tribal. To be fair, though, I understand your argument of why we don't need another Tier 8 one, but this is a pretty important Tier 8 destroyer for Britain. So Tier 8, we have 36.5 knots, speed, 4 twin 120mm guns. So similar to Legion, with the same armament, but we do have a better layout for the guns. So we have 2 facing astern versus 1 facing astern and 1 amidships. And then we have 1 quadruple 21-inch torpedo tube. So you don't have as many torpedoes as Legion, but you have the same number of guns. So where is the benefit, you're wondering? Because as of right now, Legion is better than this ship. Yes, I understand that. But for consumables, you could have repair. Then you could have smoke screen. I didn't specify which smoke screen, so it could be an American one, which would last longer. Or you could have a heal. So you could have like 2 or 3 heals. So you could get into gunfights and actually heal up some of your damage. And then you could have, for your third consumable, torpedo reload booster, considering you only have one quad launcher. Or you could have hydroacoustic search. So this should make you a very, very strong destroyer hunter. Says you have multiple guns, you have okay torpedoes for close range engagements. You could run with heal, and you could run with hydro. So you could rush smoke screens down, detect enemy destroyers before they could detect you, fire at them with your rapid firing 4-inch guns, and if they do detect you and get into a gunfight, you can sink them, and then you can heal whatever damage or some of the damage that they dish out to you. So this would be a good anti-destroyer ship, is what it would come down to. And then she would have limited use against cruisers and battleships and so on. But I think she's a pretty nice looking ship, and she was pretty important in the war as well. And that'll be it for destroyers. So now we move on to cruisers, and we start at Tier 4 with Enterprise 1943. So this is actually somewhat of a sister ship of a light cruiser called Emerald. However, the front of the ship is a little bit different than that one. So Enterprise of 1943, I say that way because I already have Enterprise in the game as a sister ship, and honestly she's already in the game too. Has a speed of 33 knots. She has 1 twin and 5 single 6-inch guns. So the twin is right there on the bow, and then you have a handful of separate turrets as well. She has 3 single 4-inch guns for secondaries, though they're probably just anti-aircraft guns at that point, and 4 quadruple 21-inch torpedo tubes. So she has a ton of torpedoes. Not gonna lie, that is a lot of torpedoes. And then 1 aircraft as well, because Tier 4, that actually is fairly important. Consumables, she would have repair, 1 heal, or a heal I should say, and then defensive anti-aircraft as well. The main reason why I have this ship is because she's unique in that she has the 1 twin turret. That was a prototype for the Leander and Arethusa class that followed her afterwards. But just having a little special ship at Tier 4 wouldn't hurt anyone. Tier 4, we don't really have a light cruiser. We have Caledon at 3.5, which is not as strong as Enterprise 43. And then we have at Tier 5 a Leander, which has the 4 twin 6-inch guns and torpedoes and everything like that. So a lot stronger than Enterprise 43. So she fits in pretty well at 4 and 5. 4.5 I meant. But yeah, nice little ship there. Next we have Dido. Dido is a special little ship. She's kind of reminiscent of an American Atlanta, but not quite nearly as powerful. So at Tier 6, she would have a speed of 32 knots, so pretty slow. She has 5 twin 133 millimeter guns, and these would be firing sap shells. So to counteract her limited gun caliber and limited gun numbers, they would have sap shells and armor-piercing shells. So you could do increased damage on angled targets, and you also have the potential of actually getting a fire and a citadel all at the same time. No secondaries though. Torpedoes, 2 triple 21-inch torpedo mounts on each side. Well, 1 on each side, 2 total. And these would fire deep water torpedoes. So she'd be able to handle destroyers and cruisers with their guns, but anything larger than that, you're just going to tickle them. So you want deep water torpedoes to try and at least mitigate a little bit of that large capital ship threat. For consumables, she's going to have a repair for the first one. She could have a smoke screen or a gun reload booster for her second consumable. So smoke if you want to increase your chances of surviving the games. Gun reload booster if you think your guns are not strong enough and or you are good at using other smoke screens from other ships and or island concealment, and then you can increase your firepower by using the gun reload booster. Additionally, for your third consumable, you can either have a defensive AA consumable because your main guns are dual purpose, or you can have a torpedo reload booster. Again, you have the deep water torpedoes, so if you run into heavy capital ship targets and you know for a fact that you're probably not going to sink a ship with 3 torpedoes, even if you land all of them, you get torpedo reload booster and launch twice the number of torpedoes you normally would. I think this would be a fun little ship, and her differences in consumables means you could set her up in many different ways and have this ship be like a jack of all trades kind of thing. And I think it would be a fairly fun ship to play. Next, we have Sydney at tier 4.5. This is a kind of a modernized or improved Leander class, pretty much used by the Australians during the war. So in this case, Sydney would have a speed of 32.5 knots, 4 twin 152mm guns, 4 single 102mm guns, and 2 quadruple 21-inch torpedo tubes. And in fact, I actually might put this ship at tier 5, because I always forget Leander is actually at tier 5. I always think she's at tier 4, and that confuses me. So instead of having Sydney at 4.5, I'd have her at tier 5. So what does she bring to the table that Leander doesn't? Because the gun power is actually exactly the same. Well, she would have a British destroyer smoke, so she could have the crawling smoke where you travel at half speed and you're still in your smoke screen, versus Leander, which has to stay in her smoke screen and can't move. Or she could choose a heal, and those are for her second consumable. So the British DD smoke or the heal for the second consumable. Heal would be nice, but the smoke screen is also a nice benefit. But you do have to choose between one or the other, versus Leander gets heal and smoke screen separately. However, for the third consumable, you could get speed boost, which is interesting in itself, or you could get hydroacoustic search. So you could potentially pop your smoke screen, activate hydro, and start raining down shells on people. And you also have an aircraft, one fighter, so you could pop the smoke screen and hide out in your smoke screen and have your plane do the spotting for you. So you can have quite a little bit of fun with the ship. Now, the armor is just about the same as Leander, so not existent pretty much. But your firepower is nothing to joke about, and your consumables would make you pretty deadly overall. And lastly, we have a tier 7. We have London, which is the only kind of rebuilt county class cruiser. She got the more modernized superstructure, the main tower there, but she still had the same armament overall. So she would have a speed of 32 knots, 4 twin 8-inch guns, 4 twin 4-inch guns for secondaries, and 2 quadruple torpedo mounts on, you can see them here as well. Now, the ship isn't that much different from the normal tech tree ship that we already have. You would have a repair, you would have a heal, and then for your third consumable, you could either get smoke screen, which is normal, or you could get a radar. So this would be another radar ship at tier 7 next to San Diego and Indianapolis, but this would be a British one. Now, there are only a couple British ships that can equip radar. Legion and Edinburgh can equip radar right now. Edinburgh is 7.5 matchmaking, and Legion is tier 8. So having one at tier 7 gives you a little bit more variety with the ships. And all of those have small caliber guns. This one has 8-inch guns. So a radar ship with 8-inch guns potentially could be very, very deadly. Or you could just have her with smoke and have it be like that. Next, we have a battleship of Royal Oak. Now, Royal Oak is part of the R-class battleship class, which was the budget version of the Queen Elizabeth's. So I still have her at tier 6 with Queen Elizabeth. She has very similar firepower, if not pretty much exactly the same. So you have 4 twin 15-inch guns and a speed of 22 knots. Secondaries, you have 12 single 6-inch guns and 4 twin 4-inch guns. So a little bit better anti-aircraft, I would say, though Queen Elizabeth already has impeccable anti-aircraft for her tier. It's so strong, it's ridiculous. You technically have 4 single 21-inch torpedo tubes that are submerged. So you could have that be the specialty of the ship as well. So not only do you get the same kind of firepower, but you also get torpedoes. And then for this ship, considering she was actually sunk by a submarine pretty devastatedly, I gave her a repair as the first consumable, another repair as the second consumable, so kind of like a copycat of Warspite, so a double repair, and then for the third one you would get a heal. So pretty fun and interesting there. There she is. Pretty nice picture, actually. And then the last one I have to go over is a carrier, which is Glorious. Now, we already have quite a few carriers in the game for the British, but this one is the only one that's kind of a little bit different. She may look fairly similar to Furious, and you'd be correct. However, she does have a few changes. And let me explain why I think we should use this carrier. So at a matchmaking tier of 5.9, so at tier 6, she'd have a speed of 30 knots. It's pretty fast. Secondary, she has 16 single 120mm guns. So she is a full-fledged secondary brawler. So she's like Hermes on steroids, believe it or not. I'd actually want these secondaries to be useful versus every other British carrier that's not Hermes. So make them useful. And she has 48 aircraft. And she'd have a repair and a defensive AA consumable. So, again, I really don't like Furious because of how worthless she feels, honestly. But having a brawler carrier at tier 6 could be kind of interesting, especially if it's British. Make it funny and give these AP shells. You can make something of her. I could definitely see it. And there is a picture of her as well. With that, that is pretty much all the British special ships I think that could be added. Like I said, the British Navy had a ton of ships, but if you're looking for special ships, those were the ones that I think that could still be added. Okay, next we have Russian special ships, and we actually have more Russian ships than British ships, believe it or not. We have quite a few that I think could be added to the game. A lot of them are pretty low tier, however, so just keep that in mind before we start. We have a couple destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 5 battleships, because there's a lot of different battleships I think we could add, even though I'm always saying that we already have too many. But again, these are all low tier battleships, and some of them are kind of copycats, so it's hit or miss on actually if we would use them or not, but they're there if you wanted to use them. So let's just start. You can pause, take a look at that if you want. Again, I'm going to go through everything here. All right, first one, destroyer at tier 5, Optini. Not quite sure how to pronounce that, so I apologize if I'm definitely incorrectly saying that. It was actually going to be, it's like a prototype for the Leningrad, but she has a kind of special history there. Tier 5, she'd have a speed of 42 knots, so exceptionally fast. So you're matching yourself against Gnevny here. You would only have 3 single 130mm guns, so you'd actually have 1 gun less than Gnevny. But you would have 2 quadruple torpedo tubes of 21-inch caliber, so you'd have more torpedoes than Gnevny. So you trade in some of your gun power for torpedo power. Consumables, you'd have repair. For the second one, you'd have smoke screen. And for the third one, you would have speed boost or torpedo reload booster, which is something Gnevny already has as well. So pretty similar to Gnevny, just a few changes there. And heck, you could make her a Prism ship and have a tier 5 Prism ship. We don't have a lot of those. I think for Prism ships, we start getting them at tier 7 and higher. Very rarely, I think, do we have anything that's below that. But I'd really like to see Prism ships at all tiers besides tier 1, honestly. It'd be fun for everyone. All right, there's another picture of her as well. And next is Storozavoy 1945. Now, we already have Storozavoy in the Russian normal tech tree line. However, Storozhevoy herself during the war had an incident where her entire front of the ship was blown off. And so they put an Ognavoy bow on the ship. So it's kind of two ships in one. So the front half of the ship is Ognavoy with a twin turret. And then the rest of the ship is a Storozhevoy with two single turrets. And these are 130 millimeter guns. She also only has two triple 21-inch torpedo tubes. So it's a little bit of a little odd design, but it kind of works out. You still have the same armament, just in a different setup. The difference really comes when it comes to her consumable. So she would have a repair for the first consumable. Second consumable, you have a choice of torpedo reload booster, considering you only have 6 torpedoes, or a British destroyer smoke. So the one where you can stay in it at half speed, and it reloads fairly quickly. And then for the third consumable, you can have speed boost, because you only go 36 knots, believe it or not. You're kind of slower. Or you could have hydroacoustic search. So again, your handful of destroyers in the game that would have hydro, this would be the Russian one. And it would be pretty interesting to see a kind of a amalgamation between a Storozhevoy and an Ognavoy in the game as well. And that would be it for destroyers, believe it or not. Next, we move on to cruisers. Well, this shows you what a normal Storozhevoy looks like, and this is what the Storozhevoy looked like in 1944. Cool, moving on. Cruisers. Askold. At Tier 2, she would be pretty similar to Aurora, Albany. What else do we have? Emden. So pretty low tier end cruisers, but they each have their own uniqueness. Askold would go 23 knots. She has 12 single 6-inch guns, so again, pretty similar to a cut down St. Louis. She also has 10 single 75 millimeter secondaries, so you can make her a little bit of a secondary brawler if you really wanted to. And 4 single 450 millimeter torpedo tubes submerged on the broadside. Again, you could do with or without the torpedoes, but the ship itself would be fairly interesting to have. She's very noticeable because of her 5 smokestacks, and that's always what kind of drew me to her. She's also one of the more advanced cruisers at this era as well. She would just have a repair, no special consumables with her. And there's a picture of her. She's just also a really nice looking cruiser, I feel. Next we have Krasny Krim. Now, some of you know this ship from World of Warships. Her nickname is the Krispy Kreme. There's a lot of hate on this ship, but honestly, I really like the Svetlana class ships. Mainly because of just how much firepower you get in such a small package. So at Tier 4, you would have a ship that goes 29 knots. You have 15 single 130 millimeter guns. You have 3 twin 100 millimeter secondaries, and 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes, and a fighter to go with it. And this honestly could be up tiered a little bit, I feel. But Tier 4 is where I have her at now. You just are made out of guns, and by the time one gun is, all your guns are done firing, the first one you fired is reloaded. So you just kind of pop them out. Auto fire would be very fun with a ship, especially 130 millimeter guns. You're going to mess up a lot of ships. Destroyers would be pretty much one shot within a couple salvos. Cruisers, you could get lots of citadels, even work on battleships a lot. It'd be insane. She wouldn't have any necessarily strong consumables though. So Krasny Kavkaz gets the defensive AA and everything like that at tier 4.5, but this one would only get a repair to kind of counteract how many guns she has. And there's another picture of her. Tier 4.5, we would have Murmansk, which, if you recognize your ships, this is just an Omaha class. Yes, it is, but it was also handed off to the Russians. It would be interesting to see this ship in the game as well, specifically on the Russian side, just because A, this camo was amazing, and B, why not have a specialized Omaha? I know there's a lot of hate for Omahas, but she's actually a fairly strong ship, believe it or not, if you know how to play her. Speed of 34 knots, 2 twin and 6 single 6-inch guns, some arranged in casemates, some arranged in turrets, 6 single 76 millimeter, and well, pretty much anti-aircraft guns, but they could be secondaries as well, and then 2 triple torpedo tubes of 21-inch caliber, and 2 aircraft. Consumables, she would have just a normal repair, but since she's at a 4.5, she can actually get a heal for the second consumable, which sets her apart from Omaha already. And then for the third consumable, I have a mix. You can either go with Hagiro, which would be very interesting, defensive AA, which you would have limited capability in doing anything substantial with, or you could even give her a Russian radar. Now, having a radar at 4.5 matchmaking could be a bit much, so I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't follow through with that. But it could be very interesting to have the only ship that has radar at this low tier be a floating citadel that is a reworked Omaha. But you do have a heal, so I mean there's that. Or you could just go straight Hydro and be a bit stronger of a destroyer hunter. I don't know. I think I would like to see Murmansk in the game. I think it'd work very easily. You just have to reskin Omaha and change some stats. And then lastly is a ship that we've actually already seen in the game twice now. However, we don't have it as an actual ship we can play. Now, I actually wrote up this list before the event in which we saw the ship, and that's kind of what has lit the fire under me to get these videos out. And that would be Stalingrad. Stalingrad would be a 9.6 matchmaking cruiser, so very similar to Moskva, or the Project 66 cruiser, except she'd be even larger and even stronger. She's actually longer than an Iowa, believe it or not. She would have a speed of 35 knots, so really, really fast. 3 triple 12-inch guns, which would make her a large cruiser and or super cruiser, depending on how you look at that. 6 twin 130 millimeter guns, 4 aircraft, and her consumables would be a repair for the first one, a heal for the second one, and surprisingly, the same kind of consumables Murmansk would get. You could either get Hydro, defensive AA, or radar for your third slot. Now, I just really, really like Stalingrad in general. I've always loved the way the ship is and how it looks. And in one of the most recent events, we actually saw Stalingrad's as one of the defending ships on the enemy team. So, A, she already has a model in game. B, she's already fully equipped. She was in the game. We could shoot her. All it would do is just to resell her as probably, I'd say, a Prism ship. And I say that not because I like Prism ships, but because we already have Project 66 as a rank point ship. We have the Japanese supercruiser as a diamond ship. We have Alaska and Guam as a Prism ship. And we haven't had a large Prism cruiser in a long time. So I would expect to see her as a Prism ship, which would be nice. And also, please give me this camo. It looks amazing. Battleship Stalingrad. All right, speaking of battleships, let's move on to battleships. First off, we're going back in time, back to Battle of Tsushima with Borodino at Tier 2. So again, this would be a ship you would see with Mikasa and Danton. Just a fun little event ship potentially, or a really cheap one if you wanted to. Just to give you some little benefits, you could even remake your little Battle of Tsushima with Mikasa and Borodino if you wanted to. 18 knot speed, pretty slow. 2 twin 12-inch guns, nothing substantial, and 6 twin 6-inch guns and 12 single 75 millimeter secondaries. So a lot of secondaries and no torpedoes, and she would just get a repair and a singular heal as consumables. There's not really a lot to go write home about, but I mean, it'd be still pretty fun to have her go against Mikasa, kind of rewrite history there. There you go. Next we have Imperator Nikolai I. This is a ship that was in World of Warships that I really always wanted, but never actually got because it was a limited edition ship. It's pretty much a copycat of the first few ships we have in the game, so I can understand if this one's not implemented. But it'd still be nice to have this as like a diamond or even a prism ship, just to make her stand out just a little bit more. So she would be at a tier 4, so next to Ganga, 21 knot speed, 4 triple 12-inch guns, 20 single 130mm guns, and 4 single 102mm guns. And you can even give her torpedoes, 4 single 450mm broadside submerged torpedoes. So that would separate her from Ganga off the bat because Ganga doesn't have torpedoes. And then this one would have repair and a heal as consumables. And you can see the ship here. It's a fairly standard Russian layout for battleships there. But this is the camo that I really, really love, and I'd love to have the ship in the game. But besides the torpedoes and slightly changed stats, it'd be very similar to Ganga. Next is October Revolution, which is actually similar to a ship we already would have had in the game, but we don't exactly have it. So this would be the modernized version of the ship at tier 5, 22.5 knots, 4 triple 12-inch guns, 16 single 120mm guns, and 6 single 76mm guns for secondaries. Technically, she also had 4 single 450mm broadside torpedo tubes. I don't really think she needs them though, but they are there in case you wanted them. And then I would say you could have a repair, a heal, and a speed boost for the ship, just to make her a little bit special. So you kind of have the improved superstructure, which actually would give the Russian battleship superstructure to hit, because ships of this low tier don't have that much. And speed boost would mean you could get around just a little bit faster than just a plain old dreadnought. So that's nice as well. Next we have Arkhangelsk, or however you would want to pronounce that. So this is actually a British battleship, another R class. So we already saw Royal Oak. This is pretty similar, except we have a little bit different consumables. So Arkhangelsk would have 22 knot speed at tier 6, 4 twin 15-inch guns, 8 single 6-inch guns, 4 twin 4-inch guns for secondaries. No torpedoes on this one, sadly, but she could get a repair, a heal, and a radar. Now, radar at tier 6 on a battleship, kind of questionable, but you have to make her somewhat separate from Royal Oak. So Royal Oak has the double repair, so increase survivability. This one would have a radar, so improve detectability of enemy ships. But again, limited usefulness. I could also see the ship as not being in the game at all, since you already would have Royal Oak potentially. So it's up in the air on whether or not the radar would actually even be there to begin with. But it was handed over to the Russians, and as one of the few actual battleships that Russia can say they had, that was pretty modernized. And similarly, we have Novorossiysk, and that would be an Italian battleship, actually the Giulio Cesare, and that is going to be a 6.5 battleship, so very similar to Andrea Doria, except the secondary layout on these ships are very different. So you would have 28 knot speed, you have 2 triple and 2 twin 320mm guns, or about 13-inch guns. You have 6 twin 120mm guns and 4 twin 100mm guns. And so versus Andrea Doria's 90 mils amidships, you have larger guns, but just not nearly as many. And so this would also complement the other modernized Italian dreadnought class that we don't have in the game. That's why I didn't put Conti di Cavour in the Italians, because we would already have the same ship for the Russians. And then you would get a repair and a heal as well. As you can see here with the Russian star. Kind of interesting. We already have a lot of Russian battleships, don't get me wrong, but a few of these I think would stand out pretty nicely, and having a couple of the Lend-Lease or the repayment battleships here, such as Novorossiysk, would be kind of interesting as well. Next up on the list of special ships would be Pan American ships. Now, as you all know, Pan American ships are not currently in the game right now. However, I did provide some possible tech trees that could become available for the Pan American lines, specifically a cruiser and a destroyer line. And I have a few ships that didn't quite match the tech tree lines themselves, and or didn't have enough ships to actually make a line, but are important nonetheless. And so I have a handful of destroyers and a few battleships that I think could be used as special ships for Naval Creed as well. So first off, for destroyers, we have Garcia y Garcia, Almirante, Quetzalcoatl, Palacios, and then for battleships, we have Minas Gerais, Rivadavia, and Rio de Janeiro. You can pause here, take a look at everything here, but I will talk about all these stats. And they also have sap shells and different torpedoes. So we're going to talk about those. First one is Garcia y Garcia. It is a tier 8.9 destroyer, so tier 9, speed of 32 knots. We have two twin 120mm guns, and that is it. No torpedoes on this destroyer. And you might be kind of confused because every destroyer has torpedoes. Yep, well, not this one. However, it does have a little bit of an advantage. So she would have sap shells, so increased armor penetration on angled surfaces and armor. And for consumables, she would have a repair as the first consumable. For the second consumable, she can either have a heal or a smoke screen. And then for the third consumable, defensive AA or a radar. So radar would help you find and hunt down enemy destroyers, and then your sap shells would make quick work of them. I'm expecting like a really, really fast reload for the ship to make up for the fact that she doesn't have torpedoes. Kind of very similar to the Forrest Sherman I talked about with the Americans. So kind of a more just straight up gun focused kind of gameplay. We kind of have that with the American destroyers already. I mean, yes, they have good torpedoes, but they also have really good guns as well. Or even more similar to the Russian destroyers. Just the guns are so good, and torpedoes, not so much. Next, we have Almirante, which is also another tier 8.9 destroyer. This ship is kind of interesting, and I'll explain why. So the information on her was actually kind of vague, so this may be incorrect, just warning you. But what I had found was she had a speed of 34.5 knots. She had 4 single 4-inch guns and 1 quintuple torpedo tube. Now, that may sound pretty terrible, and you'd kind of be correct, actually. However, she makes up with that with her other armament. So she would have extremely good anti-aircraft defense, as we have seen with some of the other destroyers as well for Pan America. And these would be fast torpedoes, is that she would have. So something different, they would go really, really fast and hit fairly decently, I would say. And then her gun power would be the 4-inch guns, which we've already seen 4-inch guns at tier 9 already with Akazuki. It's just we only have half of them. But consumables, first one would be a repair. Second would be a smokescreen or a torpedo reload booster in case you wanted to make her more of a torpedo boat versus a gunboat. And then for the third consumable, a defensive AA because in anti-aircraft defense, and a gun reload booster. So you can use your 102mm guns with sap shells to their most effectiveness. And there's another picture of her there. Next we have a Quetzalcoatl. So this is actually just a straight up gearing class destroyer that was actually sold off to Mexico after the war. And I really wanted this to be a tier 10 for the Pan American destroyer line because it would have been really interesting to have a gearing in the game with sap shells, you know, like the a heel and all that jazz that we have for the Pan American destroyer line. But it didn't quite work, and I did find a better ship but I still wanted to use this one. So Quetzalcoatl is just a Mexican gearing. She would have a speed of 36.5 knots at tier 10, 3 twin 127mm guns, and 2 quintuple 21-inch torpedo tubes. So the original layout for the gearing. For the first consumable, she would have repair, obviously. Second consumable, she would have a heal and the British destroyer smoke. So the crawling smoke, where you can travel at half speed and still be encapsulated in the smoke. And then for the third consumable, she would have a hydro. So again, this is going back to at least 1 or 2 destroyers per tech tree would have hydro. This would be the hydro destroyer for the Pan American line. And honestly, a gearing with sap shells, a heal, and a hydro, that would make for a very, very dangerous warship to deal with. And yeah, gearing is a fun little ship. I can only imagine what she would be like if she had these kind of upgrades and playstyle as well. Just another picture of a gearing class. And for the last destroyer, we have Palacios. It's very similar to a ship that's already in the game. It is a daring class, or a defender is how it's actually in the game. Palacios would also be at tier 10, 34.5 knots, 3 twin 114mm guns, but only 1 quintuple 21-inch torpedo tube. So you only have 1 launcher versus the 2 launchers we have with daring. On place of the second torpedo mount, we would have increased anti-aircraft. For consumables, we would have repair as consumable 1. For the second one, we would have a smoke screen or a torpedo reload booster in case you wanted more torpedoes. Now, mind you, these torpedoes would be deep water torpedoes as well. So similar to the Pan-Asian lines, deep water torpedoes focus heavily on the capital ships versus actual destroyers. You have your guns for that. For the third consumable, you'd have either speed boost or defensive AA, because again, Pan-American ship, you're focused heavily on anti-aircraft defense, but a speed boost would also be nice. And there's a picture of her. And that would wrap up the destroyer portion for the Pan American line. And now we move on to battleships. Now, there is actually a pretty not well-known dreadnought race or arms race for the entire South American continent. And they actually led to some pretty interesting and outrageous designs for battleships. And a handful of those, I believe, should be added to the game. So the first one we have is Minas Gerais. I have her at tier 3. I believe this is a Brazilian ship. Yes, it is. She has a speed of 21 knots. She has 6 twin 12-inch guns, 12 single 120mm guns, and 2 single 76mm guns. The layout is kind of interesting. So you have 2 super firing turrets in the front, 2 super firing turrets in the stern, and then 1 twin 12-inch on either beam as wing turrets. So you would have a maximum of 5 twin 12-inch guns on either side. There's a slightly better representation of her. She's a little bit too powerful for a 2.0 or a 2.2, so having her at 3.0 would make the most sense. Be just a nice little addition, add some spice to tier 3, would not hurt anything. For all the battleships for the Pan American line, I would have them have high explosive and armor piercing shells as well. So no sap shells necessarily for these battleships, though it could be a possibility just to make them stand out a little bit more. And then for consumables, we have repair and just a normal heal. Next, we have Rivadavia at tier 4. You can see here, this is for Argentina. A little bit better layout, I would say, or at least we're getting there. So we have speed of 23 knots, 6 twin 12-inch guns again, 12 single 6-inch guns, and 4 single 3-inch guns. However, the layout is 2 super firing forward, 2 super firing aft, and then the 2 amidships turrets are actually on echelon, so 1 on each side. However, they can rotate to both fire on the broadside. Kind of get a picture of that here. So we kind of already see that at tier 4 with ships like Kaiser, or at tier 3 just below her with Inflexible. or no, invincible, that's what it is. So we kind of already see that in the game, so it wouldn't be too far to add this ship in as well. Again, consumables, just a repair for the first one and a heal for the second one. Lastly, we have Rio de Janeiro, which is another Brazilian battleship, but it actually had a lot of different owners. Originally it was for the Turkish, then it was for the Brazilians, and then there was also, it was used for the British, so you could have it under 3 different names. Agincourt for the British, Sultan Osman I for the Turkish, and Rio de Janeiro for the Brazilians. Now, I have decided to add this ship for Brazil, and specifically for Pan America, mainly because I really don't think Britain needs another battleship, and it would be interesting to give a real powerhouse of a ship to Pan America. So I have her coming in at tier 5, not tier 6 because of a few other reasons, but tier 5. So we have a speed of 22 knots, 7 twin 12-inch guns. Yes, 7 twin turrets, the most turrets ever placed on a single battleship. We have 20 single 6-inch guns and 10 single 3-inch guns, and we even have 3 single 21-inch torpedo tubes situated in random places under the waterline. Again, with a repair and a heal. Now, the reason why I didn't put her at tier 6 because of her firepower is also because of her firepower, because they're only 12-inch guns and her slow speed. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to take a Rio de Janeiro against a Queen Elizabeth or anything like that. But this would definitely be a really good heavy hitter. And if you make her the way she is in World of Warships, making her a secondary ship, that would be pretty terrifying as well. So yeah, definitely terrifying, but also a really, really nice looking ship, and just a really unique ship as well. And that will be it. There's another picture of her for Pan American special ships. A handful of destroyers and a few battleships that I think would work really well. Lastly, on our list of countries that I think could use additional special ships is the second line that I have decided, or actually second country I've decided to add to the game, or I think could be added to the game, Pan-European. So we have quite a few destroyers and cruisers and a few battleships and 1 carrier that I think we could add just to spice things up a little bit more. So we have quite a few ships. You can pause anytime here and read these over, but I will be going over them in full detail, as always. All right, so first off, we're going to start out with Błyskawica. It is a Polish destroyer, pretty famous, and I'm actually pretty sure she's still around as a museum ship, so you can actually visit her to this day. I would have her at tier 7, with a speed of 39 knots, so fairly quick. Main guns of 3 twin and 1 single 120mm gun. Torps, 2 triple 21-inch torpedo mounts, so pretty standard overall. And then for consumables, she would have repair. Then for the second one, she would have a smoke screen. And for the third one, we would have speed boost and or torpedo reload booster for her torpedoes. So this ship, you would be purchasing her more for her historical value than the way she actually was. Yep, still a museum ship to this day. She is a pretty strong destroyer with that gun layout at tier 7. And then especially her speed, it's insane. So you'll just be rushing around the map, blasting away with your guns. Pretty nice looking ship as well. That camo would be pretty nice. Next we have another tier 7 destroyer, Visby. So Visby is a little bit different. I originally actually had her as the tier 3 destroyer in the tech tree line, and I made some changes and that made her all the way up to tier 7, believe it or not, or at least in my opinion. So she also goes at 39 knots, Swedish destroyer. She has 3 single 120mm guns. Yes, just 3 of them. So she would always be at a disadvantage when it comes to a gunfight. She also has only 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes, and they're all kind of centered in the middle there. However, what would make her separate from everyone is her consumables, as usual. First one would be repair, second one would be smokescreen, and then the third one would be defensive AA or gun reload booster. Defensive AA because she actually had quite a lot of anti-aircraft mounts, and so you would have a fully fledged Tier 7 anti-aircraft destroyer. There's not really one currently, or at least not really, so having one would be an interesting thing. Because like I mentioned before, Tier 7 is when the carriers start really getting interesting. There's a lot of variety, and then from Tier 8 and higher, there's just tons of planes. By having a Tier 7 anti-aircraft destroyer would spice things up a bit. And on the other hand, you could have gun reload booster. You only have 3 guns, but you could also have a really, really fast reload, and adding a gun reload booster with the modified mechanic could make you just melt ships left and right. Especially if you're running away, you have 2/3 of your armament facing backwards. Now, mind you, all of these destroyers also have fast torpedoes, so they're going to go extremely fast, and they might not do the most damage, but if you can at least hit targets, then the damage will be done. And there's a picture of her. Alright, next we have another Tier 7 destroyer. All of these really fit well in Tier 7. I really like Tier 7. It's so nice. This is Dubrovnik, Yugoslavian destroyer, and it has some pretty powerful armament. She goes at 37 knots, so she's really, really fast. She has 4 single 140mm guns. That's some pretty large firepower. It's just a tad larger than the French guns, even at this tier as well. So 140mm guns means they're going to definitely pack a punch. You could probably Citadel cruisers at this tier. And then we also have 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes, again with the fast torpedoes. I was kind of thinking about making her like a brawler destroyer. And so I have the first consumable of repair, and then the second one is either a smokescreen or a heal. So give her a heal means she could tangle with cruisers or destroyers, and then back out and repair some of the damage. For the third consumable, you could give her a hydro or a torpedo reload booster. So again, give her a hydro would be interesting. She's not going to be the best destroyer hunter, considering the large caliber guns would equal a long reload, and she only has 4 of them. So you're not going to get a lot of shots off before, the destroyer gets away out of the hydro. But it would be fun to have a hydro destroyer nonetheless. And you have some pretty large guns, so again, just racing around at 37 knots and just taking on anything that comes in your range. You do not have a speed boost, though. And there she is. Next is Tier 8 destroyer Stord. This is actually a British-built destroyer transferred to Norway. She has a pretty famous history as well. She took on the Scharnhorst, I believe, in a 1-on-1 engagement. Obviously, she did lose, but the heroism is quite honorable and spoken about still to this day. Stord would go at 36.5 knots. She has 4 single 120mm guns and 2 quadruple 21-inch torpedo tubes. So a little bit more firepower, more balanced layout. Again, kind of like another British destroyer at Tier 8, except this one, it's actually for Pan-European. Again, she would have fast torpedoes, and so that would separate her a little bit away from the other British destroyers. For consumables, she would have repair for consumable 1, heal for consumable 2, because if you're going to get in a knife fight with a German battle cruiser or battleship, however you want to call Scharnhorst, you're going to want some additional heal. And at Tier 8, she might run into Scharnhorst. And then for the third consumable, she could either have speed boost or hydro. So again, this one actually might be the better ship for hydro. She has a better gun layout for anti-destroyer work. The 120s would probably load faster, rotate faster, and you have enough guns and torpedoes to take on any destroyer you come across. And there she is. The next destroyer is one, again, I was trying to add into the destroyer tech tree line, but it just wasn't quite fitting. So I made it by itself. And this is the Isaac Sweers. This is a Netherlands destroyer, and she has a pretty interesting interesting armament that I think would make her fairly unique in the game. So she has a speed of 36 knots. She has 2 twin and 1 single 120mm gun, so 5 guns total, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes of 21-inch caliber, and 2 aircraft. I don't know where they keep the other one, but it says she came with 2 of them. So having a destroyer that has gunfire, torpedo power, and spotting aircraft capability would be very, very interesting. She would be a pretty large target, however, so her concealment would be through the roof, or detectability would be. However, I mean, it would be a pretty fun ship, honestly. Consumables, you would have repair for consumable 1. Second one would be a British destroyer smoke, so the crawling smoke screen, and therefore you could actually use the spotting plane to help you spot targets while you're hidden in the smoke. And then for the third consumable, I had her have either a British destroyer speed boost, so the one that lasts long, or, well, has a short duration but a short cooldown, or a radar. So we would have a radar destroyer at tier 8. And I feel like that would make her fairly unique and would give her enough advantages that people could look past her god-awful detectability and size and make her a pretty fun and interesting ship. And honestly, just having a destroyer with aircraft on it, it's really interesting. We only have 1 in the game. To be fair, I don't play it that often. Halford is not one of my go-to ships. But this ship would be fairly interesting, I feel, because tier 8, you'd have more use out of that plane than at tier 9. Alright, and next we have a Friesland. This is a Swedish destroyer, I'm pretty sure. I'm actually not too sure about that. Regardless, it's going to be almost identical to Garcia y Garcia from the Pan American line, because they are pretty much the same class of ship. Just a little bit different though, however. Friesland also goes at 32 knots, so fairly slow speed for a destroyer, and 2 twin 120mm guns with no torpedoes. However, we have HE and AP shells versus the SAP shells that the Pan American line gets. And for consumables, we have a different setup as well. So we're kind of running as a dedicated gunboat, so we would have repair for the first consumable. Then we would have a French destroyer heal for the second consumable. So the 7 heals, that's kind of overpowered for the French line. Yeah, we're putting them on this ship too. And then we would either have a French speed boost, so long lasting, or a super defensive AA. Make her just a fully fledged, straight out of the water, anti-aircraft, carrier destroying destroyer. That would be fun. So you would have a lot of health you could repair. You could go faster than your 32 knots for an extended amount of time, or you could just knock down a lot of planes if that's the way you want to play your ship. However, you are giving up your smoke that you could get with Garcia y Garcia, you're giving up your SAP shells you could get with the Pan American one, and you're giving up the radar that you could give up with the Pan American one. So both of them, even though they're identical ships on paper, or at least armament-wise, have 2 very different play styles, and one may have an advantage over the other, and vice versa. So even though they are copy-paste ships, the consumables is what really places them apart, as well as their shells and everything like that. And I would like to see both of those ships in the game. And there you go. This is how she looks like in World of Warships there. Those would be the only 2 destroyers I have listed that don't have any torpedoes, though. So I'm not making that a common theme. I do love my torpedoes on destroyers. All right, next we are getting into the cruisers. And we're going to start off with a Greek cruiser, Georgios Averov. This is actually a museum ship still. You can visit it. It's the only it's the only armored cruiser that's still around. This one's a fairly unique ship. I have her at tier 3. Also, Friesland was at tier 9, by the way. So Averov is at tier 3. She has a speed of 22.5 knots. She has 2 twin 234mm guns. So 9-inch guns, or 9.2s, I'm pretty sure. 4 twin 190mm secondaries and 8 single 3-inch secondaries. So you have a mixed armament. However, you would only have focus firepower on the two twin 9.2s. So kind of like Mount Falcone and the Pan Asian cruiser line, you would only have it would kind of play like a miniature version of Danton or Mikasa. So you'd have control over your main guns, but everything else of a smaller caliber would be considered secondaries. But she is a pretty notable ship, considering she's still around today. She would have a repair, and she would also have a heal as a tier 3 ship, which would be kind of interesting to see a tier 3 cruiser with a heal, just to make her a little bit more special. Now, obviously, 22.5 knots, you're not going to get anywhere fast, and her armor might not be the best either. She is a pretty large target, but you're kind of limited with what guns you can actually use versus which ones are going to be used as secondaries. So there's that as well. Next is a ship that I would like to see out of my own personal opinion. I've always liked the way this ship looks, and it'd be very interesting to see her in game. However, I also understand it would be kind of hard to make her work in game unless she was just a straight up event ship or a free ship or something like that. Because other than that, there's no way anyone would actually buy her. And that is Väinämöinen, or that's how I would pronounce her. This is, well, I have her listed as a cruiser, but she's more or less a coastal defense battleship for Finland, I'm pretty sure. She would be at 3.5 matchmaking. She does only go 15 knots. Now, yes, that is dreadfully slow. You could also just increase that just to, kind of fudge the line a little bit there to make her like 18 knots or something. But I mean, Langley is slow. Dingwan is slow, and they're in the game too. So she has two twin 254 millimeter guns, so pretty much 10-inch guns at tier 3.5 on a cruiser. That's impressive. She has four twin 105 millimeter guns as well for secondaries and dual purpose anti-aircraft. Consumables, she would have repair for consumable 1, speed boost for consumable 2, and defensive AA for consumable 3. Yes, I would give her a defensive AA, mainly because I'd want her to be an anti-aircraft ship. But with just large guns and a really strange looking setup, it'd be like an event ship, like one of those events that you get 2 ships out of. You have a mid ship that you earn, and then the final reward is the ship that everyone actually wants. So you could kind of do it that way. The armor on the ship is where she actually falls apart. It's like not even 3 inches or something like that. It was really, really thin. So calling her a cruiser is by far a nicety, I guess you could say, because she's not a battleship by terms of armor, but she does have very large guns for a cruiser. But her slow speed means you can't really use them all that well. But again, I think she just looks really interesting, and I've always had a soft place in my heart for her. Next, we actually have a real cruiser, Java, for the Netherlands. And kind of based off the Karlsruhe class that we already have, so I have her placed at tier 4, so she could also be with Karlsruhe for the Germans. She has a speed of 30 knots. She has 10 single 149 millimeter guns, no secondaries, and no torpedoes. So you are a straight up gunboat, and that is all. And for consumables, you would have a repair. And then for the second consumable, you could either have a speed boost, because you have a speed of only 30 knots, or you could have a hydro. And that would make her just a fairly bit interesting. And again, fairly similar to Karlsruhe, which also has a hydro at this tier, but she doesn't have a speed boost. So you can be faster than Karlsruhe, but Karlsruhe also has torpedoes, so it also has more offensive firepower. You'd also have more anti-aircraft defense potentially, considering Karlsruhe's is pretty much non-existent. If you're going to look at the numbers, it's like 4 DPS or something. I don't remember, but it's god-awful. But yeah, Java would be a fairly interesting ship to have. Pretty low tier, but straightforward, and she deserves her place in the game. Next we have De Ruyter. This is also a Netherlands cruiser. they had a lot of ships I like. She would be found at tier 6. She has a speed of 32 knots, 3 twin and 1 single 140 millimeter or 149 millimeter gun. No secondaries, no torpedoes. So again, just a straight up gunboat. She has 2 aircraft. She would have consumable of repair for the first one, a heal for the second one, and either a defensive AA or a gun reload booster for the third consumable. So again, kind of like you can see all the anti-aircraft mounts on the stern there. So having her as a defensive AA ship would be fairly interesting at tier 6. It wouldn't be too powerful, and honestly, you just shoot that rear section of the ship and a lot of her AA power would be gone. Or you could go with the gun reload booster, and for a limited amount of time, she'd actually be a fairly dangerous ship. If you get a broadside of a cruiser or a battleship, you could probably sink the cruiser in a few shots, and the battleship would potentially be half health by the time the gun reload booster went down, is my opinion. Really do like the way the tower looks like as well, believe it or not, with that kind of angled towards the front look. It is quite nice in my opinion. And this time we have a Swedish cruiser, Gotland. So Gotland is kind of a mix of a couple ships, as you see here. She's a light cruiser, but she's also a seaplane carrier. She has a very interesting gun layout, and she would play very similar to some of the Japanese ships I was mentioning earlier in the video, such as like Yugomo or Oyodo. She'd be able to use her main guns, but she'd also have a aircraft loadout as well. So Gotland has speed of 27.5 knots. I'd have her at tier 6. She has 2 twin and 2 single 6-inch guns. So you can fairly easily see the twin gun on the front here. Next to the bridge, however, are the 2 single 6-inch. And then way back here is actually the second twin 6-inch. So she has guns pretty much everywhere there. She also has 1 twin and 2 single 75mm guns, potentially used just as anti-aircraft guns. She also has 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes, so she's got a little bit of everything on this ship, and that's why I kind of like her so much. She's a very versatile ship. She also would have 8 aircraft, so you could use her as like dive bombers or a large fighter squadron, torpedo bombers, whichever one. I didn't really pick it out, but they're there nonetheless. She would have repair for the first consumable, heal for the second one, and either seaplane servicing to drop down the reload time of her aircraft, or defensive AA for the third consumable. But a mix of firepower in terms of guns, torpedoes, which could be the fast torpedoes still, but I'd probably just make them generic, honestly. Standard torpedoes, because her main chaining thing is a mix of guns, torpedoes, AA, and aircraft. There's not too many ships that can actually claim that. Shikuma is kind of like one of those ships, and she's really, really fun. And there's another picture of her there. You can actually see the torpedoes right on the amidships. And then the last cruiser we have is Canarias for the Spanish. And we already have a few Spanish cruisers in the Pan-European cruiser line, but this is one that didn't exactly fit, but is notable nonetheless because she was one that actually existed. Canarias has a speed of 33 knots. I would have her at tier 6. Also next to the County, because she was based on the County class. She has 4 twin 8-inch guns and 8 single 120mm guns on the broadside. You can kind of see them fairly easily. No torpedoes though. She has a consumable list of repair for the first one, heal for the second one, and then either hydro or defensive AA for the third consumable. Hydro would be interesting just so you can detect torpedoes, not really necessary for destroyer hunting, however. And then defensive AA because why not? You have all those guns amidships, might as well use them. And again, just really unique superstructure and funnel layout would make her stand out fairly well. And with that, we are now moving on to the battleships. And we're still sticking with the Spanish. The Espada class battleships. Pretty much the first and last Spanish battleship. Well, maybe not the first one, but the last one definitely. Espada, I would have her at 2.2 matchmaking. Now, I don't necessarily say tier 2 because of her armament, but not necessarily tier 3 also because of her armament. So she would have a speed of 19.5 knots. She has 4 twin 12-inch guns. Now, theoretically, on the broadside, she can actually use all 8 of those guns. So she would fit in with ships that get kicked into tier 3, such as Kawachi and everything like that. Or if you added South Carolina, she also has the 4 twin 12-inch guns. So the layout is kind of archaic, but the gunpowder is still there and is a bit much for a tier 2. Because Mikasa and Danton and ships like that, they're not going to last very long if you have double the firepower to them. She also has a mix of 20 single 4-inch guns arranged in casemates. Those would make for a pretty interesting secondary build if you'd like. And then she would have a repair and a heal. Nothing necessarily exactly special about the ship. Again, it's one of those just event ships you could earn for like the middle reward. Something simple. Next we have Virabes Unitist, Austro-Hungarian battleship. This one's pretty interesting actually. I do have her out at tier 4. She would go 20 knots. She has 4 triple 12-inch guns, 12 single 149mm guns, and 4 single 21-inch torpedo tubes. She has quite a substantial amount of firepower and turrets, and the turret placements are actually fairly well placed as well. A lot of good angles, pretty compact ship. She would potentially have a great maneuverability as well. And then just repair and heal for consumables. Now the torpedoes, again, it's one of those things where you could have them or you could not, but why not? And if you do, you could also make them fast torpedoes, but again, I would probably just make them standard torpedoes, pretty slow ones at that. There's a picture of her. Again, another real ship. This last battleship was a ship that was going to be built, but never was, the Greek battleship Salamis. So this one would fit in at tier 5, 23 knot speed, 4 twin 14-inch guns, 12 single 6-inch and 12 single 3-inch secondaries, and 5 single 500mm torpedo tubes. So again, pretty standard layout there. You can kind of see this artistic rendition of what she may look like. Yeah, I mean, I didn't add any battleship lines to my predictions for the tech trees because I feel like we already have enough. And the countries that don't have any don't really have enough battleships unless you just start making them up. For example, the Italians could have had an Italian battleship line, but you have so many special ships now that you'd be hard pressed to do that without copying and pasting most of them that already are in the game. So just tossing a few in there that coulda, shoulda, woulda. It'd be nice to see. And I always like Greek ships too. So tossing, like Avarov and Salamis in there, who knows? It might be nice. And lastly, we have Karl Dorman. This would be the only carrier I would have for the Pan-European line. If you couldn't tell, it's a Colossus, so kind of similar to the Majestic and Aramanche. She would be at tier 5.9, so a tier 6, so kind of up there with Majestic. 25 knots, no secondaries at all, and she would have 37 aircraft. So potentially higher tier aircraft, and then defensive AA, just one of them. But yeah, just adding a little bit of variety to everything. And with that, that will wrap up all of the special ships I would expect to see for all of the countries that are currently in the game, and even the ones that I have added onto. So Pan America and Pan European. And there we go. Now, if you're curious to see where I got all those pictures from and or my information from, I purchased quite a few books actually to do this, but they were actually for my own private collection, I guess you could say. I have quite a few encyclopedias, but these are what they are here. A really good setup Navypedia here. You have all the ships, and the blue are World War II for different countries, and World War I are the ones right here in front. really good information there. The grammar is not always the best, and the spelling is not always the best, but that's because they're not naturally English speaking authors. They do actually say that in the beginning of the book. So you do have to forgive them for that and give them a little bit of leniency. But other than that, their information is amazing. It goes everything from the smallest, the biggest battleship to the smallest little tugboat or minesweeper. And it's pretty impressive. I'm keep reading through all these books and I'm still learning stuff that I never knew, and I've been reading stuff like this for over 20 years. So, very interesting. Again, if you have an interest in naval history like I do, or want to make up your own predictions for the tech tree lines or special ships, then go ahead, look into these books. You might find something interesting. But again, thank you for watching. This was a pretty long video, I'm sure. I haven't actually stitched it all together yet, but we're going to work on that here in a moment. But yeah, a lot of good information. We went over tech tree ships in the previous video, and then these are all the Prism, the Gold, the Diamond ships, rank, anything else you could use and think of for the game. And with that, I think the game would be pretty much complete. But if they still add strange ships like they have been lately, then they'll just keep adding strange ships. But ships are always nice, regardless of where or what they come from. So thank you for watching, and have a good day.